chose to stop being human. Not in the metaphorical sense, not in the way that tyrants throughout history had chosen cruelty over compassion and were said to have lost their humanity in the act. Not in the philosophical sense of abandoning the values or the empathy that distinguished human beings from the mechanisms they built and the animals they had descended from. In the literal, biological, irreversible sense of allowing his human body to be consumed by something else, something ancient, something enormous, something that had been shaping the desert of Arrakis for millions of years before any human consciousness had arrived to name it. Leto, the second Atreides, 9 years old, walked into the desert and let the sand trout cover him. The sand trout was small. This is the first dissonance, the thing that resists comprehension when you try to hold the full scope of what happened in a single image. The creatures that would consume his humanity over 3,500 years were individually no larger than a human hand, flat, leathery, semi-permeable membranes whose ecological function was the sealing of moisture from the desert substrate. They were not dramatic in themselves. They were not the great makers, the sandworms of legend, the creatures whose scale and age made the desert feel small. They were the juvenile stage, the larval form, the beginning of the biological cycle that would eventually produce those enormous creatures. And they covered him. They formed a living skin over his body, not a costume, not an armor that could be removed when the occasion had passed, but a biological integration that began the moment the sand trout made contact with his flesh, and that would proceed slowly and inexorably through stages of transformation that Leto understood completely before he chose them. He knew what was coming. He had seen it in the prescient vision that his genetics and his preborn condition had given him access to since before his birth. He had seen every stage of what he was about to become, the decades of adjustment, the centuries of deepening integration, the millennia of progressive transformation that would carry his human consciousness inside a body that was becoming, cell by cell and year by year, something that was not human at all. He chose it anyway. This is the question that sits at the center of the God Emperor's 3,500-year story. Was this choice the act of a monster or a savior? Was the being who made this decision, who spent 35 centuries as something that exceeded every ordinary category of power and control, who governed the known universe with a completeness that no previous ruler had approached, who suppressed genuine human freedom for longer than most civilizations had existed, was this being the worst things the human species had ever produced, or the best? The Dune saga does not answer this question simply. Frank Herbert spent 4 novels building the argument, Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune constructing the conditions that made the choice necessary, God Emperor of Dune exploring what the choice actually meant across the millennia of its execution. The answer the saga provides is not a verdict, it is an examination. And what it examines is the most uncomfortable question that any story about power and responsibility can ask. What happens when the right thing to do is something that looks, from every angle available to ordinary human judgment, like the wrong thing? To understand what Leto II chose and why he chose it, you have to understand what he was before he chose. He was preborn. This is a term that carries weight in the Dune universe that it does not carry anywhere else. Not simply precocious, not simply gifted, not the ordinary sense in which some children develop faster or think more clearly than their peers. Preborn meant that Leto had been exposed, while still developing in his mother's womb, to concentrations of the spice melange sufficient to activate the genetic memory that every human being carried, but that only the most intense biochemical triggers could open to conscious access. He had other memory from the moment of his first consciousness, not from the moment of the water of life ordeal that normally opened the ancestral record to Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers, not from an identifiable transformative event that separated a before from an after. From the beginning, from as far back as his consciousness extended, which was further than any individual consciousness had extended before, because his consciousness had not begun with his birth or even with his conception, but with the activation of the ancestral presences during his in utero development. Chani, his mother, had returned to a high-spice Fremen diet during her pregnancy, a response to the contraceptive drugs that Princess Irulan had been secretly administering, a return to the traditional desert nutrition that her body was adapted to. The spice concentrations in her body had spiked, and the developing nervous systems of the twins she was carrying, Leto and his sister Ganima, had been exposed to those concentrations at the developmental stage when the neural architecture was being built. The result was 2 children, who were born already carrying the full weight of the female and male ancestral lines in other memory. 2 children who knew from their first breath everything that every ancestor in their genetic heritage had known, not as abstract information, but as lived experience, as the direct consciousness of people who had been alive and who were now present in the children's minds with the full weight of genuine personalities. The Bene Gesserit had a word for this condition: abomination. The word was not hysterical, it was diagnostic. The Bene Gesserit's long experience with the preborn condition, documented across the millennia of their institutional history, grounded in real cases of what happened when ancestral presences overpowered the developing individual's self, had shown that the preborn were at persistent risk of possession. Not mystical possession, psychological possession, the displacement of the individual self by an ancestral personality that was stronger, more experienced, more practiced at being a person than the individual self that was still forming. Alia, Leto's aunt, was the demonstration of what could go wrong. She had been pre-born through Jessica's water of life ordeal, exposed to the full force of the substance's effects while still in the womb, born carrying other memory in a consciousness that had never had the opportunity to form without it. She had managed the condition for years, governing as regent during Paul's absence, holding the ancestral presences at the boundaries of herself through sustained effort and considerable intelligence, and she had eventually lost the battle. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, present in her other memory through the Harkonnen bloodline that ran through Jessica's genetics, had accumulated enough influence in Alia's consciousness to effectively control her behavior, her decisions, her relationship with power. Leto and Ganima watched their aunt fail. They watched with the prescient awareness of children who could see the probability space of the future and who could see in that space what was coming for Alia and what the failure of her internal defenses would produce. They watched with the compassion of real love for a family member who was suffering, and with the analytical clarity of consciousnesses that had been processing the full breadth of human ancestral experience since before they could walk. They also watched each other. This was the critical difference between their situation and Alia's. Alia had been alone in the preborn condition, the only developing consciousness in her mother's womb, facing the full pressure of the ancestral presences. Leto and Ganima had each other. The development of the twins' individual selves had proceeded in the presence of another developing self, a genuine peer, a consciousness that was forming in real time alongside the other, rather than being one more ancestral presence pressing in from the past. This co-development appeared to give both twins a resilience against ancestral possession that Alia had lacked. But the resilience was not the immunity that the situation required. The ancestral presences were persistent. The Baron in particular, the man who had orchestrated the destruction of House Atreides, who had been killed by Alia herself with a Gom Jabbar at the battle for Arrakis, who was now alive in the other memory of everyone who carried Harkonnen genetics, was patient in the way that the dead can be patient. He had no timeline, he had no biological clock running down. He could wait for the moment when the individual self's defenses weakened, and he could exploit that moment with the accumulated intelligence and ruthlessness of a lifetime spent exercising exactly that kind of exploitation. Leto saw this coming. He saw it in the prescient vision that showed him the probability space of the future. Not the absolute future, not a fixed destiny that could not be altered, but the probable future, the trajectory that events were on given the current configuration of forces and choices. He saw the Baron's eventual success in Aliyah. He saw the deterioration of the regency that Aliyah's possession would produce. He saw the ecological crisis that the terraforming program's success was creating on Arrakis. The sandworms retreating as the moisture advanced, the spice production declining as the worm ecology lost territory to the greening polar regions. And he saw something else, something further out in the probability space, past the immediate crises, past the regency's deterioration, and the ecological crisis and the political manoeuvring of the various factions that were trying to position themselves in the post-Paul power vacuum. He saw with a clarity that his father Paul had glimpsed, but not fully resolved, the extinction trajectory of the human species. The extinction trajectory was not a single event. It was not a catastrophe in the ordinary sense, not an asteroid, not a war, not a disease, not any of the dramatic scenarios that the Imperium's strategic planners had developed contingencies for. It was something more subtle and more complete, the progressive narrowing of genuine human possibility by the accumulated weight of prescient guidance. This requires careful explanation because the concept is the foundation of everything Leto did, and because misunderstanding it leads to misunderstanding whether what he did was justified. The human species, by the time of the events on Arrakis, had been organized around prescient individuals and prescient institutions for thousands of years. The guild navigators used prescience to fold space. Their navigational monopoly was built on the capacity to see the probable future clearly enough to calculate safe transit between star systems. The Bene Gesserit used partial prescience to manage their breeding program, to navigate political landscapes, to position themselves advantageously in the complex power dynamics of the Landsraad. The Kwisatz Haderach, Paul Atreides, Leto's father, had used the most complete prescient vision yet produced by human genetics to navigate the probability space toward the outcomes he assessed as least catastrophic. Each of these uses of prescience produced, as a side effect, a progressive reduction in the genuine openness of the future. When a prescient consciousness navigated toward a preferred outcome, it steered events, shaped the present toward the future it had seen and chosen, directed the flow of human history away from the unpredicted and toward the anticipated. This was useful. It was often beneficial. It was also taken to its logical conclusion over sufficient time, a trap. The trap worked like this. Prescient individuals, by steering events towards seen outcomes, reduce the probability of unseen outcomes. The more effectively they steered, the more the probability space narrowed around the paths they had chosen. The more the probability space narrowed, the less room remained for novelty, for the kind of unpredicted development that could not be anticipated by any prescient consciousness, because it arose from configurations of choice and circumstance that the prescient vision had never mapped. Over millennia, the cumulative effect of this narrowing was a civilization that had become progressively less capable of generating surprise, not surprise in the trivial sense of unexpected events occurring. Those still happened within the channels that prescient guidance had not fully closed. Surprise in the deep sense, the emergence of new possibilities, unprecedented configurations of human capability and circumstance, the kind of adaptive novelty that kept a species viable across the timescales of genuine evolutionary challenge. A species that had lost this capacity, that had been guided so thoroughly by prescient consciousness that the actual future had been replaced by the anticipated future, was a species that was vulnerable to the one thing that prescient guidance could not see coming: the unprecedented challenge, the challenge that fell outside every probability path the prescient vision had mapped, the thing that no one had seen because the seeing itself had narrowed the range of what could be seen. Paul had seen this. In the prescient vision that the water of life had opened to its full depth, he had seen the extinction trajectory, had seen where the accumulation of prescient guidance was leading, had seen that the jihad he had unleashed was accelerating the narrowing rather than reversing it. He had not been able to find the path through. The probability space showed him catastrophe in every direction he looked, 61 billion deaths on the path he chose, and worse outcomes on the paths he didn't choose, and nowhere a path that avoided both the catastrophe and the extinction trajectory. He walked into the desert. He left the problem to his children. Leto saw further than his father had seen. This was not simply because Leto had more time to look, though he did eventually have 3,500 years. It was because Leto's consciousness, formed in the specific conditions of his preborn development, and shaped by the Atreides' prescient genetics at their most complete expression, could access depths of the probability space that Paul's Water of Life activated vision had not reached. Leto could see the shape of the solution. The shape was terrifying. The solution was the golden path, and the golden path required Leto to become something that every moral framework available to the human species would condemn. The problem was prescient guidance, producing progressive narrowing of human possibility. The solution was the production of human beings who could not be seen by prescient consciousness, who did not register in the probability space that prescient vision navigated, whose choices and actions and futures were genuinely invisible to any prescient faculty that tried to track them. The production of such human beings required the most intensive selective breeding program that had ever been attempted, more intensive than the Bene Gesserit's 90-generation Kwisatz Haderach project, more deliberately managed than any previous intervention in human genetics. It required the management of human bloodlines across thousands of years, with the precision of someone who could see the probability space clearly enough to know which genetic combinations would produce the desired trait, and which would not. It required, in other words, the most complete tyranny the human species had ever experienced, a single consciousness in control of the spice supply, the military force, the political authority, and the cultural influence of an interstellar civilization maintained across a timescale that exceeded what any human lifespan, even a spice-extended lifespan, could span. It required someone who could live for thousands of years, who could see the probability space with sufficient clarity to manage the breeding program's requirements, and who was willing to be what the management required, a tyrant so complete that his subjects had no genuine freedom for the duration of the project's execution. Leto looked at this requirement, and he made the calculation. The calculation was not simple. It was not the straightforward trolley problem of sacrifice the few to save the many that popular ethics presents as the paradigmatic case of difficult moral reasoning. It was something more complex. Sacrifice the freedom of everyone for 35 centuries to preserve the possibility that freedom could exist in the future that followed. Not the certainty that it would exist. Freedom was not guaranteed by the golden path. The possibility, the preservation of the conditions under which real freedom was achievable, against the alternative in which the prescient trap closed permanently and freedom became structurally impossible. This is the calculation that makes the monster or savior question genuinely difficult rather than rhetorically interesting. A straightforward monster would not have seen the problem or cared about the solution. A straightforward savior would not have required 35 centuries of tyranny to implement it. Leto was neither of these simple things. He was something that the existing moral categories were not designed to hold, a person who understood with complete clarity what he was about to do, what it would cost everyone, including himself, and why it was less bad than the alternative, and who did it anyway, and who maintained the doing across a span of time that made every previous exercise of sustained moral commitment feel brief. He walked into the desert. He was 9 years old. The sand trout covered him, and the transformation began. The immediate physical effects were dramatic enough. The sand trout's skin gave him strength that exceeded human limits by an order of magnitude, the capacity to perform physical feats that no unaugmented human body could match, to absorb impacts that would have killed an ordinary person, to survive in conditions that would have been rapidly fatal for anyone wearing only their own skin. The sand trout integration also began the process that would eventually make water lethal to him, the same biological incompatibility that made water lethal to the sandworms that the sand trout were the juvenile form of, progressively establishing itself in his hybrid biology as the integration deepened. He could still speak. He could still think. He could still feel in the emotional sense. The transformation did not eliminate his capacity for the full range of human emotional experience. It eliminated, progressively, the physical conditions under which many of those emotions could be expressed in the ways that human beings normally express them. He could feel love. He could not increasingly experience love in the embodied way that human love was normally experienced. The touch, the warmth, the physical proximity of another person's body against his own. The sand trout skin was between him and everyone else, and the sand trout skin was becoming less like a covering and more like his actual body with every year that passed. He could still see Ganima. In the early years, the first decades of the transformation, before the political structures of the God Emperor's reign had fully consolidated, before the 3,000-year project had settled into the form it would maintain for most of its duration, he could still interact with his twin, could still engage with the one person in the universe who understood what he was from the inside, because she had been formed in the same conditions. She had chosen differently. She had chosen to remain human, to marry Farad and Carino, to live a human life at human scale, to carry the Atreides legacy in the form that the family's history had always carried it. Governance, care, the practical work of maintaining something worth maintaining. He watched her age. He watched the years accumulate on her body, while his body continued its slow transformation in the other direction. Not aging, but changing, not declining, but becoming. She would die. She would die of old age, of the natural terminus of a human life, even a spice-extended one, and he would still be here, still carrying the consciousness that had developed alongside hers, still remembering what it was to be one of two and having to be one of one. The loss of Ganima was the first of many losses that the transformation imposed. It was not the most visible. The political costs, the ethical costs, the costs measured in the freedom of billions of people across thousands of years, would eventually dwarf the personal cost of losing his twin. But it was the first, and first losses have a quality that subsequent losses do not replicate, because first losses include the discovery of what loss is, the formation of the relationship between the self and the experience of losing, the specific education that cannot be transmitted in advance and that has to be lived through in order to be understood. The political consolidation of the God Emperor's power was achieved with the same completeness that characterized everything Leto did, because the Golden Path required completeness. Partial control was not sufficient. The breeding program could not be managed through influence alone, through the kind of indirect management that the Bene Gesserit had used for their Kwisatz Haderach project, shaping bloodlines through suggestion and arrangement, and the careful placement of women in positions of reproductive influence. The Golden Path required direct control. It required the God Emperor's personal management of who bred with whom, which bloodlines were combined, which genetic configurations were pursued, and which were not. This was tyranny. The word is not used loosely. What Leto established was not autocracy, which is the governance of a polity by a single ruler whose power is limited by practical constraints, even if not by formal ones. It was not even despotism, which is the governance of a polity by a single ruler who claims the right to govern without legal constraint, but who is still limited by the practical realities of maintaining power through human institutions. What Leto established was something for which the political vocabulary had to reach, a governance so complete that the governor's will was the only active variable in the political system, with every other apparent variable, the institutions, the populations, the economic arrangements, the cultural developments, being managed toward outcomes that the governor had already determined were necessary. He managed the spice. This was the most immediate and most effective lever of control available. The spice was the substance that everything else depended on: the guild's navigational capability, the Bene Gesserit's institutional practices, the longevity of the noble houses, the medical establishments, therapeutic applications, the millions of ordinary people across hundreds of worlds who had developed the cellular dependency that extended melange use produced. Control the spice, and you controlled the dependencies. Control the dependencies, and you controlled with remarkable precision the behaviors and choices and developmental trajectories of the people and institutions who were dependent. He maintained a military force, the fish speakers, an all-female army organized around principles that were different from any military tradition the Imperium had previously produced. The fish speakers were not simply soldiers. They were the institutional expression of Leto's theory about the relationship between gender, violence, and the forms of loyalty that different configurations of power and service could produce. The theory was complex, and the novels that describe it do not present it as uncomplicated. Leto's reasoning about why an all-female army served the Golden Path's purposes is presented with the characteristic density that Herbert brought to all of the God Emperor's thinking, layered with historical reference and psychological analysis and the accumulated observation of 35 centuries of watching human behavior. The core of the theory, stripped to its most basic form, the fish speakers were designed to disrupt the cultural transmission of organized violence through the channels that had historically propagated it. Not to eliminate violence, the fish speakers were genuinely capable of tremendous violence when the situation required it. To change the relationship between violence and institutional identity, between the capacity for force and the forms of meaning that human beings attached to the exercise of that capacity. He suppressed the development of prescient individuals. This was the most directly connected element of his governance to the Golden Path's central purpose. The breeding program was producing, over the millennia of its operation, humans who were invisible to prescient sight, but the program's operation required that no competing prescient consciousness arise during the program's duration. No new Kwisatz Haderach, no guild navigator whose prescient faculty had developed beyond the navigational domain. No Bene Gesserit, Reverend Mother, whose other memory had produced insights that might lead to the specific form of prescient vision that would compromise the program's execution. The suppression was achieved through the management of spice. The degree to which prescient capability developed in an individual was a function of both their genetics and their spice exposure. By controlling the spice supply, maintaining it at levels sufficient for the civilization's functional needs, but insufficient for the development of deep prescient capability in anyone other than himself, Leto ensured that no rival prescient consciousness could arise to challenge his management of the probability space. The question of what Leto Bean was like, what the experience of being the God Emperor actually felt like, from inside across the decades and centuries and millennia of the reign, is the question that the God Emperor of Dune novel is primarily interested in, and it is the question that the monster or savior judgment depends on more than any other. If Leto was a monster, the experience should be monstrous. The consciousness that held the power and exercised the tyranny should be characterized by the qualities that monstrosity implies: cruelty, indifference to suffering, the specific form of psychological corruption that unlimited power is supposed to produce in the consciousness that wields it. The history of human political thought contains a robust theory about what happens to people who hold absolute power for extended periods. They become worse. They lose the capacity for empathy. They begin to see the people they govern as instruments rather than ends. They develop the specific kind of moral insulation that allows them to do terrible things without experiencing the doing as terrible. If Leto was a savior, the experience should be sacrificial. The consciousness that held the power and exercised the tyranny should be characterized by the qualities that salvation implies: sustained suffering in service of others, the continuous awareness of what the sacrifice is costing, the maintenance of the moral clarity that makes the sacrifice meaningful, rather than simply the exercise of capability for its own sake. What the God Emperor novel describes is something that does not fit cleanly into either category. Leto was lonely. This is the most consistent and most humanly accessible thing about his experience, the thing that connects his 3,000-year existence to the ordinary human vocabulary of feeling. He was lonely in the way that anyone would be lonely who had been living for centuries without the possibility of physical intimacy, without the capacity for the embodied connection that human relationships normally included, without anyone in the known universe who could understand what he was because no one else had ever been what he was. The loneliness was not metaphorical. It was not the comfortable loneliness of the introvert who prefers solitude and calls the preference a burden. It was the honest, unrelenting isolation of a consciousness that had maintained its capacity for connection while losing cell by cell and decade by decade the physical machinery through which connection was normally achieved. He could still feel, he could still want, he could still experience the full range of what human beings experienced when they were in the presence of someone they loved and wanted to be close to. He simply could not act on any of it in the ways that human beings normally acted, because his body was no longer a human body, and the distance between what he felt and what he could do about it was growing with every year of the transformation. He kept producing Duncan Idaho Golas, partly because of this. The Tleilaxu had been growing Duncan Idaho, the Atreides swordmaster who had died defending the escape from Arrakis in the original Harkonnen attack, whose genetic material the Tleilaxu had preserved and from which they could produce new bodies that carried the original's genetic potential for centuries, and Leto had been requesting and receiving these recreations across the long span of his reign. The reason was not simple, and examining it illuminates the question of whether the God Emperor was a monster or a savior, because the answer to why he kept Duncan coming back contains elements of both. He loved Duncan. Not romantically, the word love in this context means the attachment of a consciousness to a quality in another consciousness that it finds genuinely valuable, the recognition of something worth being in the presence of. Duncan Idaho in his original form and in the recovered personality that the Gola process eventually restored in each iteration was the most consistently embodied expression of the Atreides quality that the house had ever produced. Not an Atreides by blood, but an Atreides by choice, a man who had evaluated what the house was and had decided, freely and on the basis of his own assessment, that what it was worth serving. Each new Duncan was, for Leto, an encounter with something real, something that had not been managed into existence by the prescient management that everything else in his world had been. Duncan's recovered personality was not a product of the breeding program. It was not a variable that Leto had designed. It was what Duncan was, the specific quality of the man, reasserting itself across the barrier of death and regrowth, producing each time the same essential character: loyalty freely given, judgment independently exercised, the willingness to serve what was worth serving and to resist what was not. Duncan was also the test. Each new Duncan who recovered his original memories and encountered what Leto had become was a fresh evaluation, a consciousness that had served the original Atreides and that now had to assess whether this thing, this hybrid being that claimed the Atreides name and had been governing the universe for centuries, was still something worth serving. Some Duncans accepted it, some could not. The ones who could not, who looked at the God Emperor and saw the tyranny without being able to see the purpose behind it, died, sometimes by their own choice, and sometimes by the specific pressures that the God Emperor's court produced in a person who could not accept what was happening. This pattern, the repeated production of independent judgment, the repeated confrontation between honest human assessment and the God Emperor's managed reality, was the closest thing Leto had to real feedback. In a world where everything was managed, where every apparent variable was actually under the God Emperor's control, the recovered Duncan Idaho Gola was the one element that Leto could not fully predict and did not fully control. Each Duncan brought actual surprise, not the manufactured surprise of a system generating predetermined outputs, but the unpredictability of a real person responding to real circumstances with independent judgment. Leto needed this. Not for the Golden Path. The path could have been executed without the Duncan Idaho Golas, at least in its broad outlines. For himself, for the maintenance of the consciousness that was managing the path, the consciousness that needed, across 3,500 years, to remain capable of the honest assessment that the path required. A consciousness that had lost all contact with unmanaged human response, that received only managed feedback, only the reactions of people who were inside the system the consciousness was managing, would eventually lose the calibration necessary to manage well. The Duncans were Leto's calibration, his reality check. The one input that was independent rather than managed. Hui Nori was the other genuine input, and Hui Nori was also the cruelest test the God Emperor's transformation imposed. Hui was an Ixian creation, designed, the texts suggest, as a weapon against the God Emperor, crafted with the specific biological and psychological characteristics that the Ixian analysts had calculated would appeal most to whatever remained of the human being inside the worm hybrid body. She was by design the perfect companion for Leto, the person whose presence provided the most complete possible illusion of the genuine human connection that the transformation had taken from him. She was also, despite the design, herself. This is the thing about Hui that complicates the weapon narrative. The Ixian design had produced her capabilities, but the person she was, her quality of attention, her capacity for seeing Leto as a person rather than as a political figure or a theological concept or a monstrous hybrid, this was hers. Not manufactured, not designed, the honest response of an honest consciousness to what she encountered in the God Emperor's presence. Leto loved her, not in the diminished sense that the transformation might have reduced love to, not the intellectual appreciation of qualities or the abstract recognition of value, in the full, agonizing, embodied sense of a consciousness that still possessed the entire capacity for human love, and that was encountering, after centuries of the specific loneliness that the transformation imposed, a person who made the loneliness visible by offering the thing it lacked. He could not touch her. The sand trout skin was between them. The biological transformation that was making him progressively less human and more worm was between them. The physical reality of what he had become, the vast body, the scale that made ordinary human interaction impossible, the specific texture of a surface that was not skin and not chitin, but something in between, was between them. He could speak to her. He could be in her presence. He could not hold her hand. This is the detail that the monster or savior question turns on in its most personal and most demanding form. A monster would not care. A monster who had been governing the universe for 3,000 years with absolute power, who had watched generations of human beings live and die inside the system he had built, who had managed the most consequential biological project in the history of the species, Such a monster would not be devastated by the inability to touch one person's hand. Leto was devastated by it. He was devastated not because he was performing vulnerability for the audience, or the historians, or the religious tradition that was building around his reign. He was devastated because he was still underneath the worm body and the prescient vision, and the 3,000 years of accumulated experience and the absolute power, a person. A person who had chosen to give up the physical capacity for human connection in service of a project he believed was necessary, and who was now encountering in Wee Nori's presence the full cost of that choice in its most intimate and most irreducible form. He married her anyway, knowing it would end, knowing the specific mechanism by which it would end, the bridge over the Idaho River, the fall, the water that would kill him, the designed death that was the Golden Path's final step. He married her because the alternative, spending the remaining time before the designed death without the specific quality of her presence, was a cost he was not willing to pay, even though paying it would have been the more cautious choice, even though the emotional exposure of the marriage created vulnerabilities that a more calculating consciousness would have avoided. This is either the most human thing the God Emperor ever did, or the most self-indulgent. The monster reading says he was a tyrant who wanted a companion and took one, regardless of the cost. The Savior reading says he was a person who had sacrificed everything for 35 centuries and who permitted himself, in the final years, the one thing the sacrifice had been designed to preserve the possibility of. The 3,500 years were not uniform. This needs to be said because the tendency, when confronting a span of time this vast, is to treat it as a single undifferentiated block, as if the God Emperor who governed in the 1st century was the same as the God Emperor who governed in the 30th, as if 3,000 years of experience left no mark, as if the consciousness that held the power was static across the entire duration. He changed, not in the way that ordinary people changed across ordinary lifetimes, not through the accumulation of wrinkles and slowing reflexes and the gradual dimming of faculties that aging imposed on biological systems. His body changed, yes, in the ongoing transformation that was carrying it from human toward worm. But his consciousness changed too in the more interesting way, the way that a person changes when they have been thinking about the same problems for longer than most civilizations have existed. The early centuries were the hardest, not because the governance was most demanding. In many ways, the governance became more demanding as the centuries accumulated, as the system he had built became more complex, and the variables he had to manage multiplied. The early centuries were hardest because they were the period in which the full reality of what he had chosen was still settling into his consciousness. He had known what was coming. He had seen it in the prescient vision before he walked into the desert, but foreknowledge and lived experience are different things, and the difference became apparent in the decades after the sand drought covered him and the implications of the irreversibility began to arrive. He missed his body. This is documented in the texts that survive from the God Emperor period, not as a dramatic confession, but as a quality present in the God Emperor's conversations with the various people who had access to his court. The quality of a consciousness that remembered with perfect clarity what it had been like to have a human body, to run, to swim, to feel the wind, to experience the full range of sensory pleasure that a body provided, and that was living inside a body that could no longer provide any of these things, and that was becoming less capable of providing them with every passing year. The middle centuries were different. The God Emperor of the middle period, after the first few hundred years, after the initial adjustment had been made and the governance had stabilized and the breeding program was progressing on schedule, was a consciousness that had found its equilibrium, not contentment. The loneliness did not permit contentment, and the continuous awareness of what the tyranny was costing the people who lived under it did not permit the comfort that contentment required, but a working relationship with the conditions of his existence. a settled understanding of what was required and what was possible, and where the boundaries between the two fell. During these centuries, he thought, this sounds like a minimal description of what a consciousness did across hundreds of years, but it is the most accurate one available. Leto thought about the human species, about what it was, about what it had been, about what it could become, about the specific configuration of tendencies and capabilities and limitations that made it what it was. He thought with the accumulated experience of the ancestral presences in his other memory, and the accumulated observation of centuries of watching human behavior in the controlled environment of his empire. He thought with the depth of someone who had been reading the same book for 1,000 years, and who was still finding things in it that he had not noticed before. The philosophical observations that the God Emperor novel records, the specific insights about power and governance and human nature, and the relationship between freedom and safety that Leto articulates in his conversations with Duncan and Hui and the various other people who moved through his court, are the products of this sustained thinking. They are not the casual observations of a clever person with opinions. They are the distilled results of centuries of the most intensive analysis that any consciousness had ever brought to the question of what human beings were and what they needed. Some of these observations are genuinely brilliant. The God Emperor's understanding of the relationship between comfort and capability, his insight that civilizations that became too comfortable lost the adaptive capacity that had made them successful, is an observation that would be worth making if it came from any source. Coming from a consciousness that had been watching civilizations develop and decline across 3,000 years of direct observation, it has a weight that no shorter-lived analyst could match. Some of these observations are deeply disturbing. The God Emperor's assessment of what human beings would do with freedom, his prediction that the freedom he was working to restore would be used badly, that the first thing free people would do with genuine freedom was make mistakes that prescient guidance would have prevented, is not comfortable to sit with. It is not wrong exactly, but it reveals a quality of the God Emperor's consciousness that the Saviour reading has difficulty accommodating, a contempt for the people he was saving that was not malicious but was real, grounded in the accumulated evidence of 3,000 years of watching people act on their own judgment and seeing the results. The late centuries were something else again. The God Emperor of the final period, the last few hundred years before the design death, was a consciousness that was almost finished. Not declining, the biological transformation was accelerating rather than slowing, and the prescient faculty was at its most developed and most complete. But finished in the sense of having thought through the problem as completely as any consciousness could think through it, having managed the breeding program to the point where its products were beginning to appear, having reached the stage of the project at which the remaining steps were clear and the execution was a matter of patience rather than invention. Siona Atreides arrived during this period, and Siona changed everything. Siona was the first human being the God Emperor could not see. This sentence needs a moment to land because its implications are enormous. For 3,500 years, the God Emperor had been able to perceive, through his prescient vision, the probable futures of every human being in his empire. Not in detail, not the moment-to-moment thoughts and choices of billions of individuals. In the probability space, where the broad trajectories of human lives and populations could be tracked, and the major decision points that would shape those trajectories could be identified, the prescient vision gave him the map. Not a complete map. Prescience was probabilistic, not deterministic, but a map detailed enough to manage the breeding program, to identify threats, to position resources, to maintain the comprehensive control that the Golden Path required. Siona did not appear on the map. She was invisible, not hidden, not concealed by any technology or technique or counter-prescient capability, simply not there. When Leto directed his prescient vision toward the region of the probability space that should have contained her probable futures, he found nothing, not the blank of something being blocked, but the absence of something having ever been there. Siona moved through the probability space like a gap in the data, a place where the map had no information because the map's mechanism could not detect her. She was the product of the breeding program. This is the thing that makes her appearance simultaneously the Golden Path's vindication and the God Emperor's most personal challenge. The 3,500-year project of selectively breeding for the prescient invisible trait had produced in Siona its first fully realized result. The genetics that the program had been working toward, the configuration that made a human being genuinely invisible to prescient sight, genuinely free from the probability space that prescient consciousness navigated, were present in Siona in their complete form. She hated him. This too was part of the design, or at least part of what the design produced in the person who carried it. Siona had grown up inside the God Emperor's empire, had experienced from the inside what 35 centuries of managed tyranny felt like for the people who were managed by it, had developed the honest, unmanaged response of a person whose nature made them capable of free response rather than the managed response that the rest of the population was limited to. She was angry. She was rebellious. She was willing to act on her anger and her rebellion in ways that the God Emperor's prescient vision could not fully predict, because the nature that made her invisible to prescience also made her genuinely free to choose, genuinely capable of the kind of unmanaged action that the Empire's other inhabitants, who were visible in the probability space and therefore susceptible to the God Emperor's management, could not achieve. She stole records from the Citadel. She led raids against the God Emperor's administrative apparatus. She organized resistance among the people whose nature was closest to hers, the descendants of the breeding program who carried partial versions of the invisible trait, who were not fully invisible, but who had some degree of the independence that full invisibility provided. She was doing what the God Emperor had been breeding her to do, which was to be free, and the freedom expressed itself in the conditions of the empire he had built as resistance. Leto's response to Siona was the most revealing thing about what he actually was. A monster would have killed her. The prescient invisible trait, while invisible in the probability space, was not invisible in the physical world. Siona could be found, captured, eliminated through ordinary means. The trait's value was not that it made its carrier physically invisible, but that it made them prescient invisible, and a tyrant who was simply interested in maintaining power would have seen the trait as a threat and eliminated its carrier. Leto did not kill her. He tested her. He took her into the desert that was still there beneath the God Emperor's greened zones, the deep desert where the sandworms still moved and the old Freeman ecology still operated, and he showed her the probability space. Not his probability space, not the managed view that his prescient vision provided, the raw data, the unmanaged view of what the future looked like without the Golden Path's intervention, the extinction trajectories, the narrowing, the progressive loss of genuine human possibility that prescient guidance produced. He showed her why he had done what he had done, and then he let her decide. This is the act that the monster reading cannot accommodate, and that the Saviour reading points to as its strongest evidence. A monster does not submit to the judgment of the person the monster has been breeding. A monster does not say, "Here is what I have done, and here is why I did it. Judge me." A monster doesn't give the person who hates him most the information necessary to understand whether the hatred is justified. Siona saw the probability space. She understood in the direct experiential way that the vision provided, rather than the conceptual way that explanation provided, what the extinction trajectory was and why the Golden Path had been designed to prevent it. What she saw in that desert vision, what Leto showed her by taking her into the deep desert and subjecting her to the conditions under which the prescient vision was most accessible, was not a political argument. It was not the God Emperor making his case through rhetoric and reasoning. It was the raw data, the unmediated view of the probability space, presented without interpretation to a consciousness that was genuinely free to assess it independently. The vision showed her the dead ends, the paths in the probability space that led to the species' extinction, not dramatically, not through a single catastrophic event, but through the progressive narrowing that prescient management produced, the accumulation of anticipated outcomes replacing open possibilities, the slow death of the capacity for the new that kept a species viable across the timescales of real evolutionary challenge. She saw what Paul had seen. She saw what Leto had been seeing for 3,000 years, and she saw it with the eyes of someone who was free from the prescient trap, someone whose invisible genetics meant that she was seeing the probability space as an observer rather than as a participant, seeing the paths without being tracked along them, seeing the trap without being inside it. The experience did not convert her. She did not emerge from the desert vision with the God Emperor's perspective, did not adopt his framework, did not accept the tyranny as justified in the comfortable way that acceptance would have made everything simpler. She emerged understanding and hating, understanding the necessity and hating the necessitator, holding both simultaneously because both were genuine and because the capacity to hold contradictory, genuine responses was itself a form of the freedom the Golden Path was designed to preserve. She did not forgive Leto. Understanding is not forgiveness, and the texts do not pretend otherwise. She understood and she hated, and she carried both simultaneously, which is what the Golden Path required of the people who would carry it forward. Not approval of what had been done, but comprehension of why it had been done, so that the comprehension could inform the choices that the post-God Emperor future would require, the designed death. Leto had known for centuries before it happened when and how he would die. The prescient vision showed him the specific moment, not as a distant projection, but as a convergence in the probability space, a point toward which all the trajectories he was managing were moving, the end point that the Golden Path required and that the project's completion made possible. The bridge over the Idaho River, the river named for the man whose consciousness had been a calibration device across centuries of the God Emperor's reign, the man who was present at the death in his latest Gola iteration, the man who had served and resisted and judged and served again through more lifetimes than any other consciousness in the history of the Atreides. Siona was there. Duncan was there. The specific configuration of people and circumstances that the designed death required, the combination that would produce the outcome the Golden Path needed at the moment of the God Emperor's removal, was present. He fell, or was pushed, or fell in a way that the push and the fall were the same event, because the design encompassed both the voluntary and the involuntary dimensions of the act. He fell into the water that was lethal to sandworm biology, the water that the sand trout had been sealing away from the desert for millions of years, the water that his 3,000-year transformation had made his body as incompatible with as any sandworm's body had been across the entire evolutionary history of the species. He dissolved, not instantly. The biological process of a worm hybrid's death in water was not a clean termination. It was a cascade, the ring segments rupturing, the integrated tissues coming apart, the sand trout that had been his living skin for 3.5 millennia, separating from the dissolving body and returning to the ecology. The death took time, and during that time, Leto was conscious. He could speak. He could observe what was happening to him. He could experience with the full clarity of a consciousness that had been aware of this moment for centuries, the specific reality of his ending. What he experienced, according to the accounts that survive from those who were present at the death, was relief. Not simple relief, not the shallow relief of a burden set down at the end of an ordinary day. A relief so total and so deep that the word barely contains it. The relief of a consciousness that had been holding a position for 3,500 years, and that was finally, at the moment of its ending, allowed to stop holding it. The relief of a person who had been carrying the weight of the entire human species' future on a body that was no longer human, and who was now, at last, putting the weight down. This relief is the strongest evidence the texts provide for the Saviour reading. A consciousness that experienced relief at its own death was not a consciousness that had been enjoying what it was doing. The power had not been pleasurable. The tyranny had not been satisfying. The 3,500 years had been, for the consciousness inside them, a sustained act of service that had cost everything the consciousness had to give, and that was ending with the specific quality of a debt finally paid. The sand trout dispersed into the ecology. This was the biological mechanism of the death's significance, not simply the end of the God Emperor's life, but the beginning of the next phase of the golden path. The sand trout that had been integrated with Leto for 3,500 years were not ordinary sand trout. They carried in their biology the distributed trace of the consciousness they had been part of. The Freeman tradition would call these traces the pearls of awareness, inclusions in the worm biology that were not consciousness in the individuated sense, but were something, a residue, an imprint, the biological record of 3,000 years of a human mind existing inside the worm ecology. The dispersed sand trout entered the environment. They began the cycle that sand trout biology maintained, the sealing of moisture, the creation of desert conditions, the establishment of the ecological framework that sandworm biology required, but they entered it carrying the pearls, and the worms that would eventually grow from the sand trout's life cycle would carry those pearls in their neural tissue, and the spice that those worms produced would carry whatever the pearls contributed to the spice's chemistry, and the human beings who consumed that spice and opened their consciousness to what the spice provided would find at the deepest levels of the experience something that had not been there before, something that had been thinking about them for 3,000 years. The scattering happened. When the God Emperor died, the immediate consequence was what happens to any system organized around a single point of control when that point is removed: chaos. Not metaphorical chaos, actual, immediate, practical chaos, as the institutions that had been organized around the God Emperor's management suddenly found themselves operating without the management that had made their operation possible. The spice distribution system collapsed, the fish-speaker military dispersed, the political authority that had held the empire together through the straightforward fact of being unchallengeable was simply gone. The famine times followed. This was the period of genuine privation, the period in which the civilization's dependencies on the God Emperor's managed spice supply became apparent in the most practical possible way through the suffering of people who had been depending on that supply and who now found it unavailable. The guild's navigational capability suffered. The Bene Gesserit's access to the spice quantities they needed for the spice agony became uncertain. The noble houses that had organized their economics around the stability of the spice supply found themselves in a landscape that the stability had not prepared them for. And then the scattering began. The human species, billions of people, the accumulated population of a civilization that had been growing under the God Emperor's management for 35 centuries, began to move outward, away from the center, away from the known space that the God Emperor's empire had defined, into the uncharted dark beyond the spacing guild's maps, the territory that no navigator had surveyed and no prescient vision had reached. This was the Golden Path's delivery mechanism. Not the breeding program alone. The breeding program had produced Siona and had distributed the prescient invisible trait through the human population at sufficient density to make it a permanent feature of the species' genetic inheritance. But the invisible trait without the scattering was only half the solution. The trait meant that prescient guidance could not trap the species. The scattering meant that the species was dispersed widely enough that no single catastrophe, no single failure of any specific group or any specific world could end it. The combination prescient invisibility plus physical dispersal was what the Golden Path actually accomplished. The people who scattered did not go gently. 35 centuries of managed existence had not eliminated the human capacity for action. It had suppressed it, channeled it, constrained it within the forms that the God Emperor's management permitted. When the management was removed, the suppressed capacity erupted. People moved with the energy of a species that had been contained for 3.5 millennia, and that was suddenly not contained anymore. Some of what they did with the freedom was admirable. The courage required to move into uncharted space, to establish new communities on worlds that had never been surveyed, to face the unknown without the safety net of prescient guidance or institutional support. This was real courage, and the people who displayed it were displaying exactly the quality that the Golden Path had been designed to preserve. Some of what they did was terrible. The honoured maters, the women who came back from the scattering, changed, hardened, carrying a violence that the known universe found genuinely terrifying, were also a product of the scattering. Whatever they had encountered in the uncharted dark had shaped them in ways that produced capabilities the known universe had not anticipated, and behaviours the known universe could not easily manage. Leto had seen both possibilities in the probability space. He had known that the scattering would produce courage and horror in combination, that the freedom he was working to preserve would be used for things that no managing consciousness would have permitted. He had known this, and he had judged that the combination, the courage and the horror, the admirable and the terrible, the full unmanaged range of what human beings would do with actual freedom was better than the alternative. The alternative was the prescient trap. The alternative was a species whose future had been managed out of genuine possibility. The alternative was the slow, progressive extinction of everything that made the human species worth saving. The scattering was messy, it was dangerous, it produced the honoured martyrs who would eventually burn Arrakis to glass and destroy the spice ecology that the known universe had depended on for 10,000 years. It produced new civilizations that would have their own failures and their own catastrophes. It produced a future that was genuinely unknown, genuinely open, genuinely dangerous in ways that no managed future would have been. It also produced the one thing that the managed future could never produce, genuine possibility. The chance, however uncertain and however costly, that the species would survive the challenges it could not yet see, because it had preserved the adaptive capacity that prescient management had been progressively eliminating. Was Leto II a monster? The evidence for monstrosity is not difficult to assemble. He governed the known universe as a tyranny for 35 centuries. He suppressed genuine human freedom for longer than most civilizations had existed. He managed the breeding of human beings like livestock, directing who mated with whom across millennia of what was, from the perspective of the people being managed, the most comprehensive violation of reproductive autonomy the species had ever experienced. He maintained power not through any consent of the governed, but through the straightforward fact of being physically unkillable, prescient enough to see any challenge forming, and in control of the substance that everyone needed. He permitted no genuine political freedom. He permitted no genuine cultural development that his management had not designed. He held the species in a condition of suspended development for 35 centuries because he had decided on the basis of his own assessment of the probability space that suspended development was necessary. These are the acts of a monster. Evaluated by any moral framework that places human freedom and human autonomy at the center of its concerns, these are the acts of the worst tyrant imaginable. Not the worst because of the cruelty, which was minimal by the standards of historical tyrannies, but the worst because of the completeness of the control, the duration of the control, the elimination of any genuine alternative to the control? Was Leto II a saviour? The evidence for salvation is equally available. He saw the extinction trajectory, saw it with the most complete prescient vision that had ever been produced by human genetics across the most sustained observation of the probability space that any consciousness had ever conducted. He identified the solution, the only solution, in the probability space he could access that addressed the root cause of the extinction trajectory, rather than simply managing its symptoms. He implemented the solution at a cost that exceeded anything the word sacrifice normally encompassed, giving up his humanity, his body, his capacity for the embodied connection that human love required, his freedom, his comfort, and 3,500 years of his existence to a project whose beneficiaries would never know him, never thank him, never understand what he had done for them from a position of genuine appreciation rather than theological obligation. The designed death, his willingness to die, and to die in a way that served the project rather than simply ended the suffering, is the strongest evidence that the motivation was genuine. A consciousness that had been enjoying the power would not have designed its own death into the project's structure. A consciousness that had been governing for the pleasure of governing would not have built the mechanism of its own destruction into the system it had spent 3,000 years constructing. Leto built the exit. He built it from the beginning. The golden path was never designed to last forever. It was designed to produce the conditions under which it could end, and the ending was as carefully planned as the beginning. The breeding program produced Siona. Siona's trait, distributed through the population, ensured that prescient guidance could never trap the species again. The scattering dispersed the species widely enough that no single point of failure could destroy it. And the design death removed the only remaining element of the prescient trap, the god emperor himself. He was, in the moment of his death, eliminating the last prescient tyrant, eliminating himself. The consciousness that had been managing the species' future for 3,500 years chose at the end to remove itself from the future it had been managing, because the management was the thing that had to end. Herbert did not resolve the question. This is the most important thing to say about the monster or saviour debate, because it is the thing that most readings of the God Emperor novel want to avoid. People want a verdict. They want the text to say, Leto was a monster, and here is why his actions were wrong. Or, Leto was a saviour, and here is why his actions were justified. The desire for a clean resolution is natural, and the texts deny it. What Herbert provided instead was the examination. The sustained four-novel examination of what it would actually mean for a human consciousness to see the species' extinction trajectory, to identify the only available solution, and to implement it at a cost that exceeded any ordinary framework of moral assessment. The examination is thorough, honest, and uncomfortable. It does not flinch from the monstrosity of what Leto did. It does not deny the necessity of what Leto did. It holds both simultaneously and asks the reader to hold them too. This is not moral relativism. Herbert was not saying that the question had no answer, or that all answers were equally valid. He was saying that the answer was complex, that the categories of monster and saviour were both partially accurate and both partially inadequate, that the reality of what Leto was exceeded the moral vocabulary that had been designed for beings whose choices played out across ordinary human life, scales, that the question required a new kind of thinking, and that the reader's willingness to attempt that thinking was the thing the novels were primarily interested in producing. The God Emperor's own assessment of what he was deserves weight, not because self-assessment is always accurate, but because Leto's self-assessment was conducted with more information, more sustained observation, and more rigorous analysis than any external assessment could match. He described himself, in the conversations that the novel records, as both the disease and the cure. He acknowledged that what he was doing was wrong by every ordinary moral standard. He did not claim exemption from moral judgment. He claimed that the judgment, properly conducted, would have to account for factors that ordinary moral reasoning was not designed to handle, timescales that exceeded individual human lives, consequences that played out across millennia, a probability space that included the species' extinction as a genuine and proximately likely outcome. He asked to be understood, not forgiven. This is the request that the Saviour reading takes seriously and the monster reading tends to dismiss. Understanding is not the same as approval. Understanding what Leto did and why he did it does not require agreeing that he was right to do it, but refusing to understand, dismissing the claim to necessity without examining it, condemning the tyranny without considering the alternative it was trying to prevent. This is the response that Herbert's examination of the question was specifically designed to make inadequate. You cannot honestly call Leto a monster without addressing the extinction trajectory. You cannot honestly call him a saviour without addressing the 35 centuries of suppressed freedom. The honest answer has to hold both, and holding both is uncomfortable, and the discomfort is the point. The freemen under the God Emperor's rule were not what the freemen had been. This is one of the costs that the monster reading points to most frequently, and it deserves extended examination because it illuminates something important about what the Golden Path required and what it destroyed in the requiring. The freemen of Paul Muad'Dib's time, the freemen of the Sietches, the fighters who had emerged from 80 years of Harkonnen oppression as the most capable military force in the known universe, had been shaped by the desert into something for which the Imperium had no adequate assessment. They counted their dead by the water returned. They maintained a water discipline so complete that the management of every drop was a moral and religious obligation. They rode sandworms as a rite of passage, carried crysknives as evidence of their belonging, practiced the sandwalk to survive in a landscape that killed the unprepared without sentiment. They were, in the word that best captures what the desert had made of them, forged. The God Emperor's management of Arrakis changed the conditions that had done the forging. The ecological engineering that had been running since Pardo Kynes' time, the terraforming program, the wind traps, the pioneer plants, the slow accumulation of moisture in the polar regions continued under the God Emperor's management, though in a form that was now directed by the most complete understanding of the Arrakeen ecology that any consciousness had ever possessed. Leto did not reverse the greening entirely. He arrested it partially, managed it selectively, maintained a balance between the green zones and the deep desert that preserved the sandworm ecology while allowing some degree of the environmental moderation that the original terraforming program had been working toward. The result was an Arrakis that was neither the total desert of the pre-Paul era nor the green paradise that the Fremen's original dream had envisioned. It was something in between, a managed ecology, carefully calibrated to maintain the spice production that the civilization required while providing somewhat less brutal conditions for the human population that lived in it. The freemen who lived in this managed ecology were still freemen. They still maintained the traditions. They still carried the crysknife. They still spoke the language and practiced the rituals and organized their communities around the principles that the desert tradition had developed across millennia. But the edge, the thing that the desert's unmediated harshness had produced in the people who survived it, the quality that had made the freeman fighters so much more than what the Sardaukar or any other military force could produce, this was softer, not gone, but softer, moderated by the same environmental moderation that had made the conditions less immediately lethal. The God Emperor understood this and accepted it as a necessary cost. The Golden Path required the management of the ecology because the ecology's unmanaged trajectory was towards the elimination of the sandworm through the success of the greening program, and the elimination of the sandworm would have ended the spice production that the civilization depended on. The management preserved the worm and the spice. The management also unavoidably reduced the environmental pressure that had produced the Fremen's defining qualities. There is a particular cruelty in this that the monster reading correctly identifies. The god emperor, who had been born Fremen, who had been raised in the Sietches, and who carried in his other memory the full weight of the Fremen tradition, was the instrument of the tradition's diminishment. The man who had ridden worms as a child was governing a world in which the worm ecology was managed rather than wild, in which the desert that had shaped the Fremen was partially tamed, in which the conditions that had produced the people he loved most were being deliberately moderated. He did not do this lightly. The texts that survive from the God Emperor period contain his reflections on the cost, the specific, personal, intimate cost of watching the people whose tradition had made him what he was become, something less than what the tradition had originally produced. He loved the Fremen. He loved them in the complicated way that a person loves the tradition they came from, while simultaneously being the instrument of its transformation. He knew that what he was doing to Arrakis was reducing the sharpness of the Fremen edge, and he knew that the edge had been one of the most valuable things the species had ever produced, and he did it because the Golden Path required it, and because the alternative, letting the greening proceed unmanaged until the worms were gone, and the spice was gone, and the civilization collapsed, was worse. The Museum Fremen were the later expression of this process. By the time of the God Emperor novel, 3,500 years into the reign, the Fremen who existed on Arrakis were maintaining the forms of the tradition without the pressure that had originally given the forms their substance. They were not fraudulent. They were not performing Fremen identity for an audience. They were doing what traditions do when the conditions that created them change, continuing the practices in a context that no longer demanded them, maintaining the rituals and the customs and the identity markers that the tradition had developed in a context where the identity markers were cultural choices rather than survival requirements. The God Emperor found this painful. The pain is documented in his conversations. The specific quality of a consciousness that remembered what the Fremen had been, remembered it not as history, but as lived experience, through the other memory of the Fremen ancestors in his genetic line, and that had to watch the tradition evolve into something less than what the memory preserved. He did not interfere with the evolution. He did not attempt to recreate the conditions that had produced the original Fremen quality by making the desert harsh again. He accepted the diminishment because the alternative, accepting the end of the worm ecology and the civilization built on it, was a cost he was not willing to impose. This is the monster or savior question applied to a single community rather than to the species as a whole. Was it monstrous to diminish the tradition that had produced the most capable people the species had ever generated? Or was it salvific to preserve the ecology that made their world viable at the cost of softening the conditions that had made them who they were? The answer depends on which you value more, the tradition's sharp edge or the tradition's continued existence. The God Emperor chose continued existence. The Fremen, had they been asked, might have chosen differently. They were not asked. The Bene Gesserit's relationship with the God Emperor across the 3,500 years of his reign was one of the most complex institutional relationships in the saga, and examining it illuminates both the nature of what Leto was doing and the nature of the sisterhood itself. The Bene Gesserit had been working on the Kwisatz Haderach project for 90 generations before Paul Atreides. They had invested their most sustained institutional effort in the production of the super prescient male whose capabilities would complement and extend the Reverend Mother tradition. They had managed bloodlines across the noble houses of the Landsraad for thousands of years, positioning women, arranging marriages, directing the genetic combinations that the project required, and then the project had succeeded, not in the way they had planned, not under the conditions they had designed, not in the person they had intended. Paul had come a generation early, outside their control, and had used the capabilities their project had produced to build a political and religious structure that the sisterhood had not designed and could not manage. And then Paul had produced children, the twins Leto and Ganima, who exceeded even the Kwisatz Haderach in ways that the sisterhood's analytical framework was not equipped to evaluate. Leto had then become the God Emperor, and the sisterhood, which had spent its entire institutional existence maintaining the maximum possible influence over the course of human development, found itself in a landscape where influence was not available. Not because Leto was hostile to the Bene Gesserit. His relationship with the sisterhood was more complex than hostility, but because the degree of control that the Golden Path required left no space for the kind of indirect, influence-based management that the sisterhood's entire tradition was built around. The Bene Gesserit could not manage Leto, their usual tools, the careful placement of women in positions of reproductive and political influence, the accumulation of intelligence through the network of agents the sisterhood maintained across the Imperium, the patient, generation-spanning cultivation of outcomes that their institutional patience made possible, were useless against a consciousness that could see every placement, every agent, every cultivation effort in the probability space before it materialized. The God Emperor was prescient at a level that made the sisterhood's management techniques approximately as effective as a child's attempt to surprise a parent who was watching through a security camera. They adapted. This is the thing about the Bene Gesserit that Herbert consistently presented as both their greatest strength and their most fundamental limitation. They adapted to whatever conditions they encountered, adjusting their methods and their objectives to the landscape they were operating in, maintaining the institutional continuity that was the sisterhood's most precious asset through whatever accommodations the circumstances required. Under the God Emperor, the accommodation looked like this. The sisterhood maintained itself. It continued to select and train its members, continued to practice the Prana Bindu disciplines and the other memory ordeal, continued to accumulate the institutional knowledge and the genetic capabilities that constituted its core assets. It did not challenge the God Emperor's authority. It did not attempt the kind of confrontation that would have been suicidal against a consciousness of his capability. It survived, which was, in the Bene Gesserit's institutional vocabulary, the primary obligation. But the adaptation was not total submission. The sisterhood maintained, throughout the God Emperor's reign, a quality of institutional resistance that was not overt enough to constitute a challenge, and not covert enough to be invisible to the God Emperor's prescient sight. It was something more subtle, the maintenance of the institutional identity that the God Emperor's management was designed to subsume, the preservation of the sisterhood's own understanding of its purpose against the God Emperor's redefinition of what purpose meant in a managed universe. Leto was aware of this resistance and permitted it. This is a revealing detail, a consciousness that could have eliminated the Bene Gesserit's institutional resistance, that had the prescient vision to see it and the power to suppress it, chose instead to allow it. Not because the resistance was useful to the Golden Path in any direct sense, because the resistance was evidence that the sisterhood retained the quality of genuine institutional will that the Golden Path was designed to preserve for the post-God Emperor future. If the Bene Gesserit had lost their institutional resistance, if they had accommodated themselves to the God Emperor's management so completely that the accommodation had consumed the will that made them what they were, the sisterhood would have been useless in the future that the Golden Path was creating. The post-God Emperor universe needed institutions that could think for themselves, that could respond to challenges that no prescient consciousness had mapped, that could exercise genuine judgment in genuinely novel circumstances. A Bene Gesserit that had surrendered its capacity for independent judgment to the convenience of the God Emperor's management would have been a Bene Gesserit that was not worth preserving. Leto needed the sisterhood to resist him. He needed them to maintain their independence, precisely because he was suppressing everyone else's independence. The Bene Gesserit's stubborn refusal to be fully managed, their insistence on maintaining their own understanding of their own purpose, even when that understanding was at odds with the God Emperor's framework, was part of what the Golden Path preserved. Not the most visible part, but a part that mattered, because the post-God Emperor future would need institutions that remembered what independent judgment felt like, and the Bene Gesserit were one of the very few institutions that maintained that memory across the full span of the reign. The Ixians were the other institutional relationship that illuminated the God Emperor's management and its costs. Ix was the technology world, the planet whose culture was organized around the development of machines and the engineering of solutions to problems that other civilizations preferred to solve through human capability alone. The Ixians pushed the boundary of what the Butlerian Jihad's prohibition against thinking machines actually prohibited, developing technologies that came as close to the prohibited line as the cultural and legal constraints of the Imperium permitted. Under the God Emperor's management, the Ixians served a function that was partly useful and partly troublesome. They developed technologies that the managed civilization needed, navigation machines that could partially substitute for the guild navigators' prescient capability, manufacturing techniques that the managed economy depended on, communication systems and transportation solutions, and the 1,000 other practical applications that a technologically sophisticated population produced. The God Emperor permitted this development because the civilization needed it, and because the managed economy that supported the Golden Path's requirements could not function without the technological infrastructure the Ixians maintained. But the Ixians also represented a form of resistance to the God Emperor's management that was different from the Bene Gesserits, and that was in some ways more dangerous. The Bene Gesserit resisted through the preservation of institutional will, through continuing to think independently while accommodating their actions to the reality of the God Emperor's power. The Ixians resisted through innovation, through the continuous production of new technological capabilities that the God Emperor's management had to accommodate. The navigation machines were the most consequential example. The Ixians developed, over the millennia of the God Emperor's reign, machines capable of performing the navigational calculations that the guild navigators had previously monopolized. These machines were not prescient. They did not access the probability space the way the navigators did. They performed the calculations through a different mechanism entirely, using mathematical models and sensor data rather than biological prescience to achieve what the navigators achieved through their spice-augmented consciousness. The God Emperor permitted this development partly because it served the Golden Path's purposes. The Guild's navigational monopoly was one of the prescient dependencies that the Golden Path was designed to eliminate. By allowing the Ixians to develop an alternative, Leto was creating the conditions under which the post-God Emperor civilization would not be dependent on prescient navigation for its interstellar connectivity. The navigation machines were, in this reading, a feature of the Golden Path rather than a threat to it, but the Ixians also developed Qui Nori. This was the development that demonstrated the limits of the God Emperor's tolerance and the genuine threat that unmanaged technological innovation posed to the managed system. Qui was, at the biological level, an engineered human being, designed with capabilities and qualities that were intended to affect the God Emperor in ways that natural human variation would not have produced. She was the Ixians' attempt at influence, at doing to the God Emperor, through the medium of a designed individual, what the Bene Gesserit had done to generations of Landsraad nobles through the placement of trained women in positions of personal influence. The attempt succeeded and failed simultaneously. It succeeded in producing someone who genuinely affected the God Emperor, who reached the human consciousness inside the worm body, who provided the companionship that the loneliness craved, who created in Leto the emotional vulnerability that the Ixians had been hoping to exploit. It failed in that the exploitation could not be maintained, because Hui herself, the genuine person inside the design, was not willing to be simply a tool. She developed her own relationship with Leto, her own assessment of what he was and what he was doing, her own response to the consciousness she encountered inside the hybrid body. The tool became a person, and the person's response was not what the tool's designers had intended. The God Emperor married her anyway, knowing that the Ixians had designed her as a weapon, and knowing that the design had produced someone genuine. This is one of the details that makes the monster or savior question most difficult. The God Emperor's willingness to be vulnerable to a person who had been sent to manipulate him, because the vulnerability was worth more to him than the safety that rejecting her would have provided. The religion that developed around the God Emperor is one of the most important and least examined aspects of the 3,500-year reign, and understanding it is essential for understanding what the God Emperor was doing to the human species' relationship with the divine. Leto was, in the theological framework that his reign produced, a god. Not metaphorically, not in the attenuated sense in which some political leaders had been called divine by their subjects. In the full, literal, theological sense, the living deity of a religious tradition that encompassed the entire known universe, and that attributed to the God Emperor the full range of divine attributes: omnipotence, omniscience, eternality, the right and the capacity to determine the course of human events according to his own will. He was aware that this was happening, and he permitted it. This is the detail that the monster reading focuses on most intensely, because it appears to be the most straightforwardly self-aggrandizing element of the reign. A person who permits themselves to be worshipped as a god is, in most moral frameworks, committing the most fundamental form of arrogance available. The elevation of the self above the entire category of the human, the claim to be something that the claimant knows, in the privacy of their own consciousness, they are not. But Leto's relationship with the divine claim was more complicated than this reading suggests. He did not claim to be God in the transcendent, omniscient, all-good sense that the most developed human theological traditions had developed. He claimed to be what he actually was, a being of unprecedented power and duration, capable of feats that no ordinary human could perform, possessed of knowledge that no ordinary human could access, governing with an authority that no ordinary human could challenge. The theological framework that developed around these facts was, in his assessment, inevitable. Human beings would organize their understanding of an entity with these attributes around the categories of the divine, because those were the categories that the human mind had developed for processing entities of this scale. He permitted the theology because resisting it would have been both futile and counterproductive. Futile because the theological impulse in the face of the genuinely unprecedented is not something that can be managed away. Human beings who encounter something that exceeds their categories will develop new categories, and the divine is the most available category for the processing of the genuinely unprecedented. Counterproductive because the theological framework, once established, served the Golden Path's purposes. It provided a legitimacy for the God Emperor's authority that supplemented the physical and prescient bases of his power, creating a cultural environment in which the management the Golden Path required could be maintained with less overt coercion than would otherwise have been necessary. The God Emperor was not a hypocrite about this. He did not pretend to believe in his own divinity. In the conversations that the novel records, the private exchanges with Duncan Idaho and Hui Nori, and the various other people who had access to his genuine thoughts rather than his public persona, he was clear about what he was: a human consciousness inside a worm body, doing something he believed was necessary, and using the theological framework that the human response to his existence had generated as one of the tools available for the task. He was not lying about being a god. He was allowing a framework to exist that served his purposes while being privately honest about the gap between the framework and the reality. This is either the most sophisticated political management of religion in the history of the species, or the most egregious abuse of the human need for the divine. The answer depends on whether you believe the theological impulse is something that political power has the right to manage, whether the human need for the sacred is something that a sufficiently powerful consciousness is entitled to direct toward its own purposes, even when those purposes are, in the God Emperor's assessment, aligned with the species' genuine long-term interests. The Fremen's original theology, the worship of Shai-Hulud, the desert god, the sandworm whose biology made the desert what it was, had been genuine. It had grown from the Fremen's actual relationship with their environment, from the real fact of the worm's dominance, of the ecology they inhabited, from the direct experience of living in a world shaped by a creature of overwhelming scale and antiquity. The theology was real because the thing it pointed at was real. The God Emperor's theology was also real, in the sense that the thing it pointed at was genuinely there, a being of unprecedented power and duration, governing with an authority that could not be challenged, living for millennia in a body that was becoming the same organism the Fremen had originally worshipped. But the relationship between the worshipped and the worshipper was different. The Fremen had worshipped the sandworm because the sandworm was there and was overwhelming, and was the most important single fact of their world. The subjects of the God Emperor worshipped the God Emperor because the God Emperor was there and was overwhelming and was the most important single fact of their world, and also because the God Emperor was managing the conditions under which the worship occurred. The distinction matters for the monster or saviour question because it touches on the deepest level of the question, not just what the God Emperor did but what he was. A saviour who manages the worship of the people he is saving is a troubling figure. A monster who permits himself to be worshipped is a recognizable one. The God Emperor was neither of these simple things. He was a consciousness that understood, with the accumulated analysis of 3,000 years, exactly what the theology meant, and exactly what it cost, and exactly why it served the project he was executing, and that maintained this understanding without allowing it to become either cynicism or self-deception. He was aware that the worship was real. The people who prayed to him were genuinely praying. The faith they placed in his divinity was genuine faith, as real and as deep as any faith the species had ever generated. He respected this, or at least acknowledged it, while simultaneously understanding that the faith was partly a product of the conditions he was managing. He did not dismiss the worshippers. He did not treat them with contempt, though the temptation to contempt across 3,000 years of being worshipped by people who did not understand what they were worshipping must have been considerable. He maintained toward them the complicated relationship that anyone who is genuinely responsible for other people maintains toward the people they are responsible for. A combination of care and distance, of genuine concern, and the specific form of separation that responsibility imposes between the responsible and the cared for. The Tleilaxu deserve their own examination in the context of the monster or saviour question, because the Tleilaxu's relationship with the God Emperor illuminates something about the nature of the managed system that other relationships do not. The Bene Tleilax were the biological engineers of the Imperium, the culture that had developed over millennia of specialized practice the capability to grow human bodies from genetic material, to restore the memories of the originals in those bodies through traumatic triggers, to produce the Gola recreations that constituted their most politically significant product. They were also, in the cultural dimension, a deeply secretive religious society whose internal practices and theological commitments were deliberately hidden from the broader civilization. The God Emperor used the Tleilaxu. This is the bluntest available description of the relationship, and it captures something essential that more diplomatic language would obscure. Leto used the Tleilaxu's capability, their ability to produce Duncan Idaho Golas, specifically for his own purposes. He requested and received successive recreations of Duncan across the centuries of his reign, each one grown from the same genetic material, each one carrying the potential to recover the original Duncan's personality and memories through the right combination of circumstances and stress. The Tleilaxu complied. They complied partly because the God Emperor's power made non-compliance impractical, and partly because the compliance served their own institutional interests. The ongoing relationship with the God Emperor gave the Tleilaxu a form of access to the center of power that their marginal political position in the broader imperium would not otherwise have provided. The relationship was transactional. The Tleilaxu provided Duncans, the God Emperor provided the political protection and the resources that the Tleilaxu's continued operation required. What the God Emperor understood about the Tleilaxu, that the Tleilaxu did not fully appreciate, he understood, was the depth of their biological engineering project. The Tleilaxu were not simply growing golas. They were developing across the millennia of the God Emperor's reign increasingly sophisticated biological capabilities that constituted their own form of the human augmentation project that the Bene Gesserit's breeding program represented. The Tleilaxu were engineering the future of human biology in their own way, according to their own theological framework, toward their own vision of what the species could become. Leto permitted this because it served the Golden Path, not because the Tleilaxu's vision for the species' future was compatible with the Golden Path's purposes. It was not, or not entirely, because the development of diverse biological capabilities in the human species was part of what the scattering would need. The post-God Emperor future required human populations that were not uniform, that possessed different capabilities and different biological potentials, that could adapt to the genuinely unknown conditions of the uncharted space into which the scattering would carry them. The Tleilaxu's biological engineering, however problematic its motivation, produced exactly this kind of diverse capability. This is the God Emperor as strategic thinker at the deepest level, using the Tleilaxu's own institutional ambitions, which were independent of and partially opposed to the Golden Path's purposes, as instruments of the Golden Path's requirements. Not managing the Tleilaxu directly, not directing their research or their development priorities, simply permitting them to do what they were inclined to do, knowing that what they were inclined to do would contribute to the conditions the Golden Path was designed to create. The monster reading of this relationship is straightforward. The God Emperor used the Tleilaxu as tools, exploiting their religious commitments and their institutional ambitions to serve purposes they did not understand and would not have approved of. The Savior reading is more nuanced. The God Emperor's management of the Tleilaxu was part of the comprehensive strategy that the Golden Path required, conducted with the awareness that the Tleilaxu's own interests were being served even as they were being used. The question of what the God Emperor's experience of time was like has been touched on, but deserves more sustained attention, because the temporal experience of a consciousness that has been alive for 3,500 years is one of the most fundamental differences between Leto and any previous ruler in the history of human governance. Ordinary rulers governed within the temporal framework of an ordinary human life. Their decisions played out across decades at most. Their planning horizons extended to the end of their own reigns, or in the most far-sighted cases, to the reigns of their immediate successors. The consequences of their choices were visible to them within their lifetimes, and the feedback between action and consequence was fast enough that mistakes could be identified and corrected before they became irreversible. Leto governed within the temporal framework of a geological era. His decisions played out across centuries and millennia. His planning horizon extended across the full span of the Golden Path's requirements, 3,500 years in which every significant choice had to be evaluated not against its immediate consequences, but against its contribution to a project that would not be complete until the consciousness that designed it was dead. The feedback between action and consequence was measured in centuries, which meant that mistakes could not be identified through ordinary observation. They could only be identified through the prescient vision that showed the probable futures resulting from each choice, and that allowed Leto to evaluate the consequences before they materialized. This temporal framework produced a quality of consciousness that was different from any previous human experience. Not simply more experienced, not simply a person who had seen more than other people because they had lived longer. Different in kind because the accumulation of experience across 3,500 years produced understanding that was not simply the extension of shorter-lived understanding, but something categorically different from it. A person who has been thinking about human nature for 3,000 years understands human nature differently from a person who has been thinking about it for 30 years. Not just more completely, though that is true as well. Differently, the patterns that become visible across millennia of observation are not the patterns that become visible across decades. The slow cycles of cultural development and decline, the recurring structures of institutional behavior, the deep regularities in human response to freedom and constraint and abundance and scarcity, these are patterns that require centuries of sustained observation to become apparent. And the God Emperor had centuries of sustained observation in quantities that exceeded any previous observer's experience by orders of magnitude. The understanding that this produced was not comfortable to encounter. The people who interacted with the God Emperor, the Duncans, the court officials, the occasional visitor who was granted audience, consistently reported the experience of encountering a consciousness that was operating on a different temporal scale from their own. Conversations with the God Emperor had a quality of asymmetry. The God Emperor knew things that the other person could not know because the knowing required centuries of observation that the other person had not had, and the gap between what the God Emperor understood and what anyone else could understand was not bridgeable through explanation alone. This asymmetry is one of the sources of the loneliness that the texts document. The God Emperor was lonely, not simply because he lacked physical companionship, but because he lacked intellectual companionship, because there was no consciousness in the universe that had been thinking for long enough and observing with sufficient depth to engage with him at the level his own thinking had reached. The Duncans came closest because the original Duncan Idaho's quality of judgment was genuine, and the recovered personality maintained that quality across the iterations. But even Duncan could not bridge the gap between a consciousness that had been thinking for centuries and a consciousness that had been thinking for decades. Leto spent a great deal of his private time with his own journals. The writings that the novel excerpts and references, the God Emperor's personal records, the accumulated observations and analyses that he maintained across the centuries of his reign, constituted the most sustained and most intensive examination of the human condition that any consciousness had ever produced. They were the product of a mind that had been examining the same subject for longer than any previous mind had examined anything, and they carried the weight of that duration in every observation. Some of these observations have the quality of wisdom. They are the genuine insights of a consciousness that has seen enough to know what it is seeing, not the performance of wisdom, not the adoption of a wise posture, but the real thing, the understanding that comes only from having actually been through what the understanding describes. The God Emperor's observations about the relationship between power and isolation, about the cost of sustained responsibility, about the specific way in which the consciousness that holds absolute power is changed by the holding. These are observations that carry the weight of 3,000 years of direct experience and that cannot be dismissed as theoretical. Some of these observations have the quality of justification. They are the defenses of a consciousness that has been doing something it knows is wrong by the moral standards it is claiming to serve, and that is constructing across the centuries an increasingly sophisticated explanation for why the wrongness was necessary. The monster reading points to these passages as evidence that the God Emperor was engaged in the most extended exercise of self-justification in human history, that 3,000 years of thinking about why the tyranny was necessary had produced not genuine understanding, but the most refined possible version of the tyrant's excuse. The honest reading holds both. The God Emperor's thinking was both wisdom and justification, both the genuine product of 3,000 years of observation and the self-serving narrative of a consciousness that needed to believe in the necessity of what it was doing in order to continue doing it. The two were not separable. The wisdom was real, the justification was also real, and the specific relationship between them, the way the genuine understanding served to support the continued exercise of the tyrannical power, is one of the most uncomfortable things the saga asks the reader to sit with. The relationship between the God Emperor and his own death was the most sustained meditation on mortality that any consciousness had ever conducted. Ordinary human beings develop their relationship with death across the decades of an ordinary lifespan, beginning with the childhood discovery that death existed, developing through the adolescent confrontation with the concept, maturing into the adult accommodation that allowed people to continue living productive lives despite the knowledge that their lives would end. This developmental process was compressed into a relatively short period of any given life, and the accommodation once reached tended to remain roughly stable for the remainder. Leto's relationship with death was not like this. He had known from the first years of his reign when and how he would die. The prescient vision had shown him the bridge, the river, the fall, the water, the dissolution. He had known for 3,500 years that his death was coming and exactly what form it would take. The accommodation that ordinary people reached with the concept of mortality, the acceptance of the abstract fact that their lives would end, was for Leto the accommodation with the specific, detailed, personally experienced foreknowledge of the exact mechanism of his ending. 3,500 years of knowing how you will die is a different kind of knowledge from any ordinary mortal experience. It is not the generic awareness that death is coming eventually. It is the sustained, unbroken, centuries-long awareness of a specific event, the bridge, the water, the dissolution that is approaching at the rate of 1 year per year, and that cannot be avoided, because avoiding it would mean abandoning the project that the death is the final step of. The God Emperor's courage is not often discussed in these terms, but it deserves to be. A consciousness that has maintained the willingness to die, the genuine, not merely theoretical willingness, across 3,500 years of foreknowledge, is demonstrating a form of courage that the word does not quite stretch to contain. Not the courage of the soldier who faces death in the immediate circumstance of battle, where the adrenaline and the training and the specific pressures of the moment carry a person through. The courage of sustained acceptance across millennia, maintained without the adrenaline and without the training and without the specific pressures of the moment, maintained simply through the continuous exercise of the will against the biological imperative to survive. He could have avoided it. This is the thing that makes the courage genuine rather than theatrical. The God Emperor had the physical capability to survive almost anything. The sandworm hybrid body was nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons, and the prescient vision gave him advance warning of any attempt to harm him. He could have avoided the bridge. He could have avoided the river. He could have continued to live indefinitely in the hybrid body that the transformation was producing. The biological transformation was not leading toward a natural death. The sandworm biology that was replacing his human biology was potentially immortal, capable of existing for geological ages without the kind of biological decline that produced death in ordinary organisms. He chose the death. He designed it into the project. He made the death the project's completion, the final step that released the sand trout back into the ecology, that seeded the pearls of awareness through the next generation of worms, that removed the last element of the prescient trap from the civilization's future. The death was not something that happened to him, it was something he did. the last act of a 3,500-year project, executed with the same deliberateness that every other step of the project had been executed with. The relief is documented. The quality of release, the specific, personal, intimate experience of finally, after 3,500 years, being permitted to stop, is present in the accounts of the death and in the fragments of the God Emperor's own writing that address the prospect. He was not eager for death in the way that a person who has been suffering is eager for relief. He was ready for it in the way that a person who has been working is ready for rest, not because the work was unbearable, but because the work was finished and the consciousness that had been doing it was entitled to its ending. The aftermath of the God Emperor's death is the strongest evidence for either reading of what he was, for the monster reading, the chaos, the famine times, the collapse of the managed system into the unmanaged reality that 3,500 years of management had left the civilization unprepared for. The billions of people who suffered in the transition, who had been living inside the managed system and who found themselves, when the management was removed, without the institutional or personal resources to navigate the unmanaged world. The honoured matres who came back from the scattering carrying the trauma and the violence that the uncharted dark had produced in them, who burned Arrakis to glass and destroyed the spice ecology that the civilization had depended on, who demonstrated in their specific combination of capability and damage exactly what the freedom the Golden Path had preserved could produce when it was used badly. For the saviour reading, the survival, the human species survived the chaos, survived the famine times, survived the honoured matres and the burning of Arrakis and the collapse of the old order and the rise of the new, survived because the Golden Path had done what it was designed to do, dispersed the species widely enough that no single catastrophe could end it, produced the prescient invisible trait that ensured no future prescient consciousness could trap it, created the conditions under which genuine human freedom, with all its costs and all its dangers, was possible rather than foreclosed. The Bene Gesserit survived. They adapted to the post-God Emperor landscape with the institutional flexibility that the God Emperor's management had preserved in them, the capacity for independent judgment that their resistance to his management had maintained across the millennia of the reign. They confronted the honoured matres. They merged with the honoured matres under Odraid's leadership, producing a new institution that combined the capabilities of both traditions. They continued the project of human development in the forms available to them in a landscape that was genuinely new. The worms survived, one worm carried from Arrakis before the burning, a single specimen from which the ecology could be restarted. Slow, the timescales of ecological establishment were geological rather than political, but real. The biology that had produced the spice and the water of life and the conditions under which the Fremen tradition had developed was going to continue. Not on Arrakis, on Chapter House, on whatever worlds the No Ship eventually reached, on worlds that the ecology's future carried it to, in timescales that the human political consciousness found difficult to hold. The question that sits at the centre of the God Emperor's story and that makes the monster or saviour judgment genuinely difficult is whether the survival justifies the cost, whether 3,500 years of suppressed freedom, of managed existence, of the most complete tyranny the species had ever experienced, is justified by the outcome, a species that is free, not comfortably free, not safely free, free in the way that the Golden Path was designed to produce, genuinely capable of genuine surprise, genuinely exposed to genuine danger, genuinely open to the full range of what human beings can be when no prescient consciousness is managing them toward predetermined outcomes. Herbert did not answer this question. He presented the evidence, 35 centuries of evidence, examined from every angle that 4 novels of sustained narrative could provide, and he left the verdict to the reader. The verdict requires the reader to make a judgment about what matters most, freedom or safety, genuine possibility or managed certainty, the courage to let the species find its own way, or the caution of guiding it toward outcomes a wiser consciousness has determined are best, the God Emperor made his judgment. He chose freedom at the cost of everything, his own humanity, his own body, his own capacity for the love that the freedom he was preserving was supposed to make possible. 3,500 years of his own life spent inside a body that was becoming less capable of the human experiences he was working to preserve with every passing decade. He asked to be understood, not forgiven. The understanding is what the saga provides. The forgiveness is what the reader decides. There is one more thing to say about Leto II Atreides, and it is the thing that the monster or saviour debate most consistently overlooks. He was a person, not a function, not a role, not a philosophical argument with a worm body. A person, a consciousness that had feelings and preferences and attachments and vulnerabilities, that missed the wind on human skin and the taste of food and the sound of music heard through human ears. A person who had loved his twin sister and watched her age and die. A person who had loved Wee Nori and married her, knowing that the marriage would end in his designed death. A person who had produced Duncan Idaho Gola after Duncan Idaho Gola, partly because the Golden Path required a genuine human calibration, and partly because Duncan had been the best person the Atreides tradition had ever produced, and Leto wanted to be in the presence of something that good. The debate about whether he was a monster or a saviour tends to treat him as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. Was the tyranny justified? Was the Golden Path necessary? Were the costs proportional to the benefits? These are valid questions, and the saga provides the material to address them carefully. But they are not the only questions, and they are not the questions that the God Emperor of Dune novel is most centrally interested in. The novel is interested in what it was like to be him, what the loneliness felt like, what the memories cost, what the relationship between the human consciousness and the worm body produced in the space between them, what it was like to hold the weight of the species' future while progressively losing the capacity to be part of the species' present. The answer to these questions is not a verdict. It is a story. The story of a person who made a choice at 9 years old and spent 3,500 years living with the choice and then died in a way that completed what the choice had been about. Not a good person in the simple sense, a person who did things that the word good does not cover. Not a bad person in the simple sense, a person whose badness was in service of something that the word bad does not diminish. A person who was, in the end, exactly what the name of the novel said he was, the God Emperor of Dune. Not a god in any transcendent sense, not an emperor in any conventional sense, something that the vocabulary of human experience was not designed to hold, a consciousness that had exceeded the category of the individual, that had lived longer than categories, that had governed on timescales that categories could not capture, that had sacrificed what categories said was most important in service of what categories said could not exist. The desert received him when he died, the water took the body, and the sand trout took the ecology, and the pearls of awareness went into the biology, and somewhere in the depths of the new worms that would grow from the sand trout that had been him, the trace of 3,000 years of thinking about the human species continued to exist, not as a voice, not as a personality, as a quality, a depth in the spice that had not been there before, a dimension in the water of life that Reverend Mothers after him would encounter and find different from what Reverend Mothers before him had encountered. A residue of the most sustained act of will the species had ever produced, distributed through the ecology that had shaped him and that he had, in the end, become. The monster or the saviour? The answer is both. The answer is neither. The answer is that the question itself, while valid and important, is not large enough to contain what Leto II actually was. He exceeded the question the way he exceeded everything else, not by being better than it, but by being more than it could hold. The desert remembers him, the worms carry him, the spice holds what his consciousness left in the biology it inhabited, and the species he spent 35 centuries trying to save is out there, in the dark beyond the maps, using the freedom he preserved for them, using it well sometimes, using it badly sometimes, using it. That was all he asked for. Paul Atreides, Leto's father, is the most important context for understanding why the God Emperor's choice was what it was, because Paul had the same vision. Paul had seen the same probability space. Paul had understood with a clarity that the water of life had given him, and that no previous human consciousness had possessed, the extinction trajectory and the narrowing and the prescient trap. Paul had known what needed to be done, and Paul had not done it. This is not a judgment of Paul's moral character. It is a statement of what happened. Paul saw the golden path, understood what it required, assessed the cost, and chose not to pay it. He walked into the desert instead. He left the throne and the power and the responsibility and the vision, and he walked into the desert and became, or possibly became, the texts do not resolve the question entirely. The preacher who stood in Arrakis streets and attacked the religious establishment that had been built in his name. This choice, it was not cowardice. Paul was not a coward, and the desert walk was not an act of fear. It was an act of assessment, the judgment of a person who had looked at what the golden path required and who had concluded that the cost was more than he was willing to pay, not more than any person should be willing to pay necessarily, more than he was willing to pay. The distinction matters because it is the distinction between moral judgment and personal limit, and Paul was honest enough about his own limits to recognize them. What the golden path required was the sacrifice of everything Paul was. Not the sacrifice of his life, that would have been simple by comparison, the kind of sacrifice that the heroic tradition had been preparing people for since the first stories were told. The sacrifice of his humanity, his body, his capacity for the human connection that his love for Chani represented, his identity as a human being, his membership in the species he was trying to save. The golden path required that whoever walked it become something other than human and remain that something for 3,500 years and die at the end of those years, having spent them as the most complete tyrant the species had ever produced. Paul looked at this and said no, or rather, Paul looked at this and could not say yes. The vision showed him what saying yes would mean, not the abstract idea of sacrifice, but the lived reality of it, day after century after millennium. The loneliness, the transformation, the progressive loss of everything that made him recognizably Paul, his face, his body, his ability to touch Chani's hand or hear Ganima, speak or feel the wind of the desert on his skin. He could not choose this for himself. The capacity for this choice was not something he possessed, and his unwillingness to pretend otherwise was in its own way a form of honesty that deserved respect. But the problem remained. Paul's refusal to walk the golden path did not eliminate the extinction trajectory that the golden path was designed to address. The prescient trap was still closing. The narrowing was still proceeding. The species was still moving toward the future in which genuine possibility had been managed away, replaced by the anticipated outcomes that prescient guidance consistently chose. Leto saw this. He saw what his father had seen, and he saw what his father could not bring himself to do, and he saw that the seeing without the doing was not sufficient. The vision without the willingness to act on it was not going to save anyone. The species needed not simply someone who could see the golden path, but someone who could walk it. He walked it at 9 years old, knowing everything that it would cost, knowing that the knowledge of the cost would not reduce the cost by 1 day or 1 degree of the transformation, knowing that 3,500 years of knowing what he had chosen would be worse in the specific experiential dimension of living through them than the not knowing would have been. The comparison between Paul and Leto is the comparison that the saga constructs most carefully, because it illuminates the question of what we owe the future, what obligation the present generation has to the generations that have not yet been born, what price the living are entitled to impose on themselves in service of the not yet living, what sacrifice is justified when the beneficiaries cannot consent to it and cannot express gratitude for it. Paul's answer was, the cost is too high. The sacrifice that the golden path requires is more than I can give. The species will have to find another way or accept the consequences. Leto's answer was, there is no other way. The probability space has been examined with every analytical tool available. The extinction trajectory is real. The golden path is the only path through it that preserves the possibility of genuine human future. The cost is everything, and everything is what it costs. Neither answer is obviously wrong. Paul's recognition of his own limits was honest, and the honesty was valuable. Leto's willingness to exceed his limits, to sacrifice more than any person should be asked to sacrifice in service of something that could not be achieved within the boundaries of ordinary moral commitment, was also valuable, and the value was paid for in the specific currency of everything that the sacrifice consumed. The saga presents both answers without declaring one superior to the other. It shows what Paul's choice produced: the regency, Aaliyah's deterioration, the ecological crisis, the political instability of a civilization that had been promised a saviour and had been given a saviour who left. It shows what Leto's choice produced: the tyranny, the managed existence, the 3,500 years of suppressed freedom, the design death, the scattering, the chaotic freedom of the post-God Emperor future. Both answers had costs. Both answers preserved something and destroyed something. The judgment between them is the judgment that the reader makes, not the judgment that the text imposes. The fish speakers are worth deeper examination because they represent the God Emperor's theory of institutional violence put into practice, and the theory reveals something important about what kind of thinker Leto was and what kind of manager of human affairs his 3,000 years of observation had produced. The decision to create an all-female military was not arbitrary, and it was not symbolic. It was the product of the God Emperor's analysis of the relationship between organized violence and the cultural transmission of power across human history. The analysis was this: male-dominated military institutions across the full span of the ancestral record that other memory provided had consistently developed institutional cultures that glorified violence for its own sake, that made the capacity for destruction a source of identity and prestige, that transmitted from generation to generation a relationship with violence that was not purely instrumental but was entangled with questions of meaning, of masculine identity, of what it meant to be strong. This was not a condemnation of men. It was an observation about what institutions did to the people inside them, and about how the specific combination of male social bonding and organized violence produced, over time, cultural patterns that made violence self-perpetuating rather than instrumental. The Sardaukar had been the Imperium's demonstration of this pattern, a military institution whose culture had become so thoroughly organized around the capacity for violence that the capacity had become its own justification, independent of the purposes it was supposedly serving. Leto wanted a military that served a function without becoming an identity. He wanted soldiers who could perform violence when violence was required, without constructing from the performance a mythology of violence that would persist and reproduce itself independent of the military's actual utility. His observation, based on 3,000 years of watching human behavior, was that female social bonding produced different institutional cultures from male social bonding, not better, not morally superior, but different in their relationship with violence. Cultures in which the capacity for destruction was less likely to become a source of meaning, in which the instrumental relationship with violence was easier to maintain, in which the institution's culture was less likely to drift toward the glorification of its own capacity. The fish speakers were the implementation of this theory. They were loyal to the God Emperor personally, not to an abstract principle, not to an institutional identity, not to the mythology of their own capability. To him, personally, the loyalty was individual rather than institutional, which made it more resilient in some ways and more fragile in others. It was resilient because individual loyalty could not be subverted by institutional drift. The fish speakers did not develop the independent institutional identity that the Sardaukar had developed because their identity was organized around a person rather than around a concept. It was fragile because the person around whom the loyalty was organized would eventually die, and the loyalty would have to find a new form or dissolve. This fragility was deliberate. The God Emperor designed the fish speakers to dissolve after his death. Not immediately. The institutional momentum of any organization that had been operating for centuries would sustain it for some time after the removal of its central figure, but eventually. The fish speakers were not designed to outlast the God Emperor's reign. They were designed to serve the reign's purposes and then to disperse, releasing the capable women who had served in them back into the general population, carrying whatever skills and whatever perspective the service had given them into the post-God Emperor future. The Freeman tradition of the Tao orgy, the communal sharing of the converted water of life, the neurochemical bonding that had held the Sietch communities together, was, in Leto's assessment, the spiritual precursor to what the fish speakers were doing with loyalty. The Fremen had used the biochemistry of the spice to create bonds of community that exceeded what ordinary social interaction could produce. The fish speakers used the psychology of personal loyalty to create bonds of institutional cohesion that served a similar function in a different context. Both were management of the human capacity for bonding. Both produced communities whose cohesion exceeded the ordinary. Both served the larger purposes of the consciousness that directed them. And both, in the God Emperor's assessment, were honest about what they were, tools for the management of human social capacity toward ends that the managing consciousness had determined were necessary. The Duncan Idaho iterations across the God Emperor's reign constitute one of the saga's most sustained examinations of what identity actually is. The question that the Duncans posed in their repeated appearance and disappearance and reappearance across centuries was this: what is the minimum necessary condition for a person to be the person they claim to be? Is genetic identity sufficient? Is the recovery of memories sufficient? Is the reassertion of the original personality's characteristic judgments and responses sufficient? Or is identity tied to temporal continuity in a way that makes each Duncan a different person from the one before, despite carrying the same genes and eventually the same memories? Leto's answer, demonstrated through his treatment of the successive Duncans rather than articulated in philosophical terms, was that identity was located in the quality of judgment rather than in the continuity of the body or the memories. What made Duncan, what made each iteration genuinely the person Leto valued rather than simply a body with the right memories, was the reassertion each time the memories were recovered of the quality that had made the original Duncan worth admiring. The capacity for independent judgment, the willingness to serve what deserved service, the refusal to serve what did not deserve service, regardless of the consequences of the refusal. Each Duncan, when his original memories were recovered and the Gola's personality was replaced by the originals, went through a period of assessment. The newly recovered consciousness found itself in a world it had not made and did not understand, a world ruled by a worm hybrid being that claimed to be the son of the Duke Duncan had served, in a civilization that had been managed into a form that no one from Duncan's original era would have recognized. The assessment period was the time during which the recovered Duncan evaluated what he was seeing and decided whether what he saw was still worth serving. Some Duncans decided yes, some decided no. The ones who decided no, who looked at the God Emperor and saw the tyranny without being able to see through the tyranny to the purpose it served, represented the honest human response to the God Emperor's power, the response that an independent consciousness would naturally have to the most complete exercise of authority the species had ever produced. Their rejection was not wrong. It was the genuine response of genuine judgment to a genuine situation, and the fact that it was based on incomplete information that the Duncans who rejected the God Emperor did so without access to the full prescient picture that justified the tyranny in Leto's assessment did not make the rejection less genuine. Leto valued the rejecting Duncans as much as the accepting ones. This is the detail that most clearly distinguishes the God Emperor from the straightforward tyrant. A tyrant who was simply interested in maintaining power would have valued the accepting Duncans and punished or eliminated the rejecting ones. Leto valued both because both demonstrated the quality he was trying to preserve: genuine human judgment, operating independently of the managed system, producing responses that were not predetermined by the management. The rejecting Duncans proved that the management had not consumed the capacity for genuine response. The accepting Duncans proved that the genuine response could, when it had access to sufficient information, accommodate the management's purposes within its own framework. Both proofs were necessary. Both proofs were evidence that the human quality the Golden Path was designed to preserve was still present in the managed population. The final Duncan, the collar who was present at the designed death, who watched the God Emperor fall into the Idaho River and dissolve in the water that was lethal to the worm biology, was the Duncan who would eventually board the no-ship in the Chapter House period and carry the Atreides question into the dark beyond the maps. His judgment, recovered across multiple lifetimes and refined through the extraordinary experience of serving a consciousness that exceeded every ordinary category of power, was the most tested version of the quality that Leto had been preserving, not tested once. Tested across iterations, across deaths and rebirths, across the accumulated experience of having been repeatedly confronted with the most demanding assessment any human judgment could be asked to make. The Carino accommodation deserves mention because it represents the God Emperor's management of the old political order and illustrates the principle of management through absorption rather than destruction. The Carinos, the family that had held the imperial throne for 10,000 years before Paul Atreides, that had been displaced by Paul's victory, that had retained enough political identity and enough institutional memory to constitute a potential source of opposition, were managed by the God Emperor not through elimination, but through incorporation. They existed within the managed system. They maintained their identity, their family traditions, their sense of themselves as the rightful holders of a throne that had been taken from them. They were not persecuted. They were not exiled to the margins. They were given a place within the God Emperor's system, a place that was explicitly subordinate but not degrading, that acknowledged their historical significance while making clear that the historical significance did not translate into current political authority. This was the God Emperor's management principle applied to the political domain: absorb rather than destroy. The destruction of the Carinos would have eliminated a source of potential opposition, but would also have eliminated the institutional memory and the cultural identity that the Carinos represented. The absorption preserved both while channeling them into forms that served the managed system rather than threatening it. Kanima's marriage to Farad'n Carino, the political and personal arrangement that had been made in the early years of the God Emperor's transformation, was the foundational act of this accommodation. The Atreides and the Carinos were joined, which meant that the Carino opposition lost its political foundation. You could not oppose the ruling house when the ruling house was your own house by marriage. The accommodation was elegant, and it was also genuine. Ganima's relationship with Farad'n was not purely political, and the children they produced were genuinely both Atreides and Corrino, carrying both bloodlines and both traditions in a form that made opposition to one's own genetic heritage genuinely difficult to sustain. The God Emperor's management of the noble houses more broadly followed the same principle. The Landsrat, the Congress of Noble Families that had constituted the Imperium's political infrastructure for 10,000 years, was not abolished. It was maintained in a form that was explicitly subordinate to the God Emperor's authority, but that preserved the institutional structures and the family identities that the houses had developed across their histories. The houses existed, they maintained their traditions, they competed with each other in the constrained forms that the managed system permitted. They did not exercise genuine political power, because genuine political power was the God Emperor's and no one else's, but they maintained the capacity for political thinking and political action that the post-God Emperor future would need. This is the paradox of the God Emperor's management. He preserved the things he was suppressing. He maintained the institutions that his tyranny made powerless. He kept alive the traditions that his management had rendered irrelevant. He did this because the Golden Path's purpose was not to eliminate human political capacity, but to preserve it through the period in which it could not be safely exercised, to keep the institutions and the traditions and the capacities alive in the diminished form that managed existence permitted, so that they would be available when the management ended and the genuine exercise of political capacity became both possible and necessary again. The preacher stands as the counterpoint to the God Emperor in the saga's architecture, and the comparison between what the preacher did and what Leto did illuminates the monster or saviour question from a different angle. The preacher, who was almost certainly Paul Atreides, returned from the desert walk to address the religious establishment that had been built in his name, operated on Arrakis during the early years of the transition between Paul's reign and Leto's transformation. He stood in the streets of Arrakis, and he told the truth about what the Muad'Dib mythology had become, a structure of power disguised as a structure of faith, an institution that served the institutional interests of its operators rather than the spiritual needs of the people it claimed to serve. The preacher was doing what the Atreides tradition said you were supposed to do, tell the truth about power to the people who needed to hear it, regardless of the cost to the person who told it. He was doing this without the Golden Path's justification, without the prescient vision's endorsement, without the comprehensive management framework that Leto would develop. He was simply telling the truth, because the truth was what the situation required, and it was not enough. The truth-telling accomplished its immediate purpose. It disrupted the Chisarate's comfortable certainties. It challenged the mythological structure that was calcifying around the Muad'Dib name. It provided a voice for the discomfort that many people in the Imperium felt about what the Jihad's religious legacy had become. But it did not address the underlying problem. It did not solve the extinction trajectory. It did not break the prescient trap. It did not produce the conditions under which genuine human freedom would be structurally possible, rather than simply a value that people spoke about while living inside a system that was progressively eliminating it. The comparison between the preacher and the God Emperor is the comparison between two different responses to the same vision. The preacher said, "This is wrong, and I will say that it is wrong, and the saying will be my contribution." The God Emperor said, "This is wrong, and I will fix it, and the fixing will cost more than the saying ever could, and I will pay the cost because the alternative is worse." Both responses were the responses of a consciousness that understood the problem and chose to address it in the way its nature permitted. The preacher's response was more comfortable, more recognizable as the kind of thing that good people were supposed to do, more compatible with the moral frameworks that the species had developed for evaluating the behavior of good people. The God Emperor's response was more effective. It actually addressed the underlying problem, actually produced the conditions for the species' long-term survival, actually accomplished what the preacher's truth-telling, however important it was as a moral act, could not accomplish. But the effectiveness came at a cost that the comfort did not. The preacher's truth-telling cost the preacher his life. He was killed by a mob, murdered for the discomfort his words produced. This was a genuine cost, genuinely paid. It was not, however, the cost of 3,500 years of managed tyranny. It was not the cost of everything. Leto paid the cost of everything, and the payment bought something that the preacher's sacrifice, genuine as it was, could not buy: the actual structural conditions under which the species could survive, the challenge that no prescient consciousness could see coming. This is the final form of the monster or savior question. Is effectiveness a sufficient justification for the cost of achieving it? Does the fact that what Leto did actually worked, actually preserved the species, actually broke the prescient trap, actually created the conditions for genuine freedom, justify the 3,500 years of unfreedom that the preservation required? The question does not have a comfortable answer. The saga does not provide one. What the saga provides is the evidence, the full 4-novel, 35-century span of evidence about what the God Emperor did and what it cost and what it produced. The evidence is comprehensive and it is honest, and it does not flinch from either the monstrosity or the salvation. The reader decides, and the deciding is, in a way, the most Atreides thing about the entire saga. The insistence that the question be asked, that the evidence be examined, that the judgment be made by genuine human consciousness, operating freely rather than by a managed consciousness, operating within a framework that someone else has determined, is correct. What is your power for? What does it owe? What will you not do to preserve it? The God Emperor answered these questions across 35 centuries. The answer cost him his humanity, his body, his capacity for love, and eventually his life. Whether the answer was right is the question Herbert left for the species the God Emperor spent those centuries trying to save. The species is still deciding. In the dark beyond the maps, in the freedom that the Golden Path preserved, in the genuine uncertainty that prescient trap would have eliminated, the descendants of the scattering are making choices that no prescient consciousness can see and that no managed system can predict. They are free. That is what Leto paid for. Whether the price was worth it is the question that will never stop being asked, and the asking is the answer. The ecological dimension of the God Emperor's reign is the dimension that most directly connects his story to the broader argument about ecology and consciousness that the Dune saga makes across all 6 novels. Arrakis was not simply a setting, it was an argument. Frank Herbert built the planet as the most complete possible demonstration of the principle that ecology shapes consciousness, that the environment in which a species exists determines, more than any intentional effort or any cultural program, what that species becomes. The freemen were what they were because the desert had made them. The sandworm was what it was because the desert had made it. The spice was what it was because the sandworm had made it. The entire chain of consequence that produced the Imperium's political structure, the Guild's navigational monopoly, the Bene Gesserit's breeding program, and the Kwisatz Haderach himself was downstream of the ecological reality of a single planet's biology. The God Emperor understood this ecological argument more completely than any consciousness before him, because the God Emperor was part of the ecology, not adjacent to it, not studying it from outside, not even living inside it in the way that the Freemen had lived inside it for millennia. Part of it, integrated with the sand trout that maintained the desert, carrying the biology that produced the spice, existing as a node in the ecological network rather than as an observer of it. This understanding informed every aspect of his management. When Leto made decisions about the terraforming, when he decided which areas of Arrakis would be permitted to green and which would be maintained as desert, when he calibrated the sand trout's moisture sealing function to maintain the ecological balance that spice production required, he was making those decisions from inside the system rather than from outside it. The ecological information that the integration made available to him, the chemical signals, the substrate patterns, the deep time trends that the living worm biology was attuned to, gave him a resolution of ecological understanding that no external analysis could match. The decision to maintain the deep desert was not aesthetic, it was functional. The sandworm ecology required extreme aridity to operate. The specific biochemistry of the pre-spice mass, the metabolic product that accumulated in the substrate before erupting as the spice blow, was only possible in conditions of near-total dryness. The introduction of moisture, even at the margins, even in the controlled form that the managed terraforming represented, affected the substrate chemistry in ways that reduced the pre-spice mass's formation rate in the adjacent areas. Leto had to balance these effects with the precision of someone who could feel what the ecology was doing, who experienced the substrate chemistry through the sand trout integration rather than measuring it through instruments. The managed ecology of the god Emperor's Arrakis was the most sophisticated environmental management the species had ever attempted. Not the most dramatic, the original terraforming program, with its vision of a green Arrakis, had been more dramatic in its ambition, but the most sophisticated in its execution, because it was being managed by a consciousness that was part of the system being managed, that could feel the ecological responses to every intervention in the specific immediate way that a person felt the responses of their own body. This is the ecological argument for the God Emperor's management. The Golden Path was not only a political and genetic project, it was an ecological one. The management of Arrakis' ecology, the preservation of the conditions under which the spice could be produced, the maintenance of the sandworm population that the spice production required, the calibration of the greening to allow human habitation without destroying the worm ecology, was itself a contribution to the species' survival that exceeded what any external management could have achieved. The ecological argument is also the one that most directly counters the monster reading's strongest point. And the strongest point of the monster reading is the suppression of freedom, the 3,500 years during which billions of people lived without genuine political or personal autonomy, managed by a consciousness that had decided on its own assessment that the management was necessary. The ecological argument responds, the management was not arbitrary, it was not the imposition of one consciousness's preferences on a passive population. It was the specific, informed, ecologically grounded management of a system that would have collapsed without management, and whose collapse would have ended the spice production that the civilization depended on, which would have produced catastrophe at a scale that made the suppression of freedom look mild by comparison. This is not a comfortable argument. It is not supposed to be comfortable. The God Emperor did not ask for comfort, and the saga does not provide it. But the ecological argument is the one that most directly addresses the question of necessity, the question of whether the management was actually necessary, or whether the God Emperor was simply a tyrant who had found a sophisticated justification for his tyranny. The ecology says it was necessary. The system would have collapsed without management. The management required the kind of sustained, informed, insider understanding that only the God Emperor's specific form of existence could provide. The alternative to the management was not a differently organized, but still functional civilization. The alternative was the end of the spice, the end of the worm ecology, and the cascading collapse of every institution and every community and every individual whose existence depended on the spice's continued availability. The physical transformation that the God Emperor underwent across the 3,500 years deserves more detailed attention than the broad description provides, because the details reveal something important about the cost the Golden Path imposed on the consciousness that walked it. The early stages, the first decades after the sand trout covered him, were the period in which the hybrid body was most recognizably human. Leto could still walk upright, he could still manipulate objects with human hands, he could still eat, though his dietary requirements were changing as the sand trout integration modified his digestive biology. He could still be present in human spaces, could sit at a table, could be in a room with other people, could participate in the physical dimension of human social life with only the sand trout skin as the visible marker of his difference. This changed, slowly across decades and then centuries. The transformation proceeded. The sand trout skin thickened. The underlying musculature began to shift toward configurations that were no longer human, the body lengthening, the limbs becoming less functional as manipulative appendages and more integrated into the body mass that was developing around them. The face, the last recognizably human feature, maintained longer than any other part of the body, eventually began its own transformation, the features softening and broadening as the worm biology asserted itself. By the middle centuries, the God Emperor was no longer physically capable of the human interactions that the early decades had permitted. He could not sit at a table. He could not be in an ordinary room. He required specific accommodations, the royal cart, the engineered vehicle that transported his increasingly worm-like body through the corridors and spaces of his citadel, designed to accommodate a body that was larger than a human body and differently configured and progressively less compatible with the architecture that human beings had designed for human bodies. He could still speak. This is the detail that preserved his capacity for human interaction across the full span of the reign. The vocal apparatus remained functional. The speech centers of the brain remained active. The capacity for verbal communication persisted even as every other form of physical interaction was progressively eliminated. His voice changed over the centuries as the body that produced it changed, but it remained intelligible, and it remained his primary tool for the relationship with the world that the transformation was otherwise consuming. He could feel. This is the detail that made the transformation cruel rather than merely strange. The sensory apparatus that processed pain and pleasure, heat and cold, pressure and texture, this remained functional across the transformation. The God Emperor could feel the sand trout skin, could feel the substrate beneath the royal cart, could feel the vibrations of human speech and the presence of other bodies in his vicinity. He could feel what he could no longer do anything about, the warmth of another person's proximity, the texture of air on skin that was no longer skin, the missing weight of hands that could no longer hold anything. By the final centuries, the transformation was approaching its completion. The body was predominantly worm. The ring segments that characterize sandworm anatomy were developing along the body's length. The internal organs were reorganizing toward the worm's biological configuration. The tissues were becoming chemically incompatible with water in the same way that the adult sandworm's tissues were incompatible. The human elements that remained, the face, the vocal apparatus, the brain that maintained the consciousness, were islands in a body that was becoming something else, something ancient, something that the desert's evolutionary history had been producing for millions of years, and that was now, in this unprecedented instance, carrying a human mind. The dissonance between the consciousness and the body is the most personally costly aspect of the transformation, and the one that makes the sacrifice claim most difficult to dismiss. A consciousness that had been human, that had been formed in human circumstances, that carried the full weight of human experience through the other memory, that thought in human categories and felt in human registers and wanted what human beings wanted, was living inside a body that was becoming the most inhuman thing the planet had ever produced. The wanting persisted, the capacity to fulfill the wantings did not. This is not the suffering of a martyr who endures pain for a cause. This is the suffering of a consciousness experiencing the progressive, irreversible loss of every physical capacity that its nature was designed to exercise. Human consciousness was designed, not intentionally, but through the evolutionary history that had produced it, to exist in a human body, to interact with the world through human senses and human limbs and human skin. Leto's consciousness was operating in a context that was becoming progressively less compatible with its design, and the incompatibility was not something that adaptation could fully address. 3,500 years of living in the wrong body is not something the human consciousness was designed to manage, and the management was itself a sustained act of will that consumed resources that could have been used for other things. What the scattering actually produced, what the genuine freedom that the Golden Path preserved actually looked like when human beings started using it, is the final element that the monster or savior assessment has to account for. The scattering was not a single event. It was a process, the movement of billions of people across centuries from the known universe into the unknown, not organized, not managed, not directed by any prescient consciousness toward any predetermined outcome. The people who left were leaving because the conditions of the post-God Emperor universe, the famine times, the collapse of the managed system, the disappearance of the security that 35 centuries of management had provided made leaving seem better than staying, or because the sheer momentum of 3,500 years of suppressed human energy suddenly released carried them outward in the way that compressed gas expands when the container is opened. They went into the dark, into the space beyond the guild's maps, beyond the reach of any prescient vision, into territory that had never been surveyed, and that the known universe's institutional apparatus had no framework for navigating. They went with whatever capabilities they carried, the Bene Gesserit training for those who had it, the fish speaker discipline for those who had served, the Tleilaxu biological capabilities for those communities, the various skills and traditions and institutional memories of the civilizations they had come from. And they encountered things. The saga does not fully describe what the scattered populations found in the dark. This is one of the deliberately unresolved elements of the narrative, the territory that Herbert left for the reader's imagination, and for the seventh novel that was never written. But the honoured martyrs who came back carried the evidence of what some of them had found, capabilities that the known universe had not produced, traumas that the known universe had not inflicted, a relationship with violence and domination that the known universe's cultural traditions had not developed. The honoured martyrs were not the only thing the scattering produced. They were the thing that came back most dramatically, that forced itself on the known universe's attention through the burning of worlds and the exercise of capabilities that the existing institutions found genuinely threatening. But the scattering produced uncountable other outcomes as well. Communities and civilizations and adaptations and developments that the saga gestures at without fully describing, populations that encountered the genuinely unknown and responded to it in ways that no prescient consciousness could have predicted, and that the human species' adaptive capacity, preserved through the Golden Path, made possible. This is what Leto purchased with 35 centuries of tyranny. The chance, not the certainty, not the guarantee that the species would use its freedom well. The chance, the structural possibility that genuine freedom represented, the openness of the future that the prescient trap would have closed, the capacity for the species to encounter the unknown and respond to it with genuine novelty, rather than with the anticipated responses that prescient management would have channeled it toward. The honoured maters were the cost of the chance. They were the demonstration that genuine freedom produced genuine danger, that the species, freed from prescient management, would do terrible things as well as admirable ones. The burning of Arrakis was the most catastrophic single act that the post-God Emperor freedom produced. The destruction of the ecology that had sustained the civilization for 10,000 years, accomplished by people whose experience in the uncharted dark had produced capabilities and traumas that the known universe could not easily manage. But the species survived it. This is the Golden Path's final vindication, and the evidence that the purchase was worth the price. The species survived the worst thing the freedom produced, not because a prescient consciousness had seen the disaster coming and steered events to avoid it, because the species had been dispersed widely enough and had developed enough diverse capability that no single catastrophe, however devastating, could end it. The worm ecology restarted on Chapter House. The Bene Gesserit absorbed the honoured matres and produced a new institution. The No ship departed into the dark, carrying the combination of human capability and biological potential that the next phase would need. The species continued, not safely, not comfortably, not with any guarantee that the next challenge would be survivable, freely. This is the word that the God Emperor's entire existence was organized around preserving the possibility of, freely, the species continuing to exist, continuing to develop, continuing to encounter the unknown and respond to it, without the prescient management that would have made the responses safer and the development more comfortable and the existence more secure and the entire project of human life progressively less worth living. Leto II was a monster who preserved freedom. He was a saviour who suppressed it. He was both of these things simultaneously across 35 centuries of the most sustained moral commitment any consciousness had ever maintained, and the judgment of whether the commitment was justified is the judgment that the species he preserved is still making. The desert received him. The water took him. The sand trout went into the ecology carrying what he had been. And somewhere in the dark that no prescient vision can reach, the descendants of the people he governed are free. Monster, saviour, both, neither. The answer is still being written by the people who inherited the question.